to Apologetics 101. I am your host, Christian apologist Brian Keith Bowen. I'm wearing my usual Indiana Jones hat. I'm also wearing a Liberty University t-shirt. Anyway, today we are going to be doing part 3 of my debate review series that I've been doing on the debate between Matt Dillahunty and Dr. Jonathan McLatchie on modern day debate. This video is going to be over the open dialogue segment of that debate. Now, that open dialogue segment went quite a bit of time. And of course, I'm stopping it and pausing it and talking constantly. So when I did my notes, I came up with almost 100 points with that. I think it was like 90. I want to say 94, maybe 94 points, something around there. And I have 62 points just for this particular video. So I decided to split it into 2 videos, 2 parts after all. I think I mentioned I might have to do that with the open dialogue, so I will. And we're going to basically be doing open dialogue 1 today, and we're also going to be doing open dialogue 2 pretty soon. I'll probably have it short. I already got the notes for it, so I'll probably do that pretty soon from now. Right now I am just doing the open dialogue 1, the first video, which is containing 62 points of notes that I put down for it. And without further ado, let's dive in. Okay, welcome back. I forgot to mention in my opening statement, full disclosure, I have permission from James Coons, the host of Modern Day Debate, to do this debate review, and he also opened the door for me to do other debate reviews on this channel, which I really appreciated that he gave me that open invitation. Of course, this debate review has been months in the working, but we're finally here. I already did the first 2 parts, and now I'm doing the part 3, and I'll be doing part 4 pretty soon. This video series will have 5 parts in it. But I do have permission to do this, so I have open permission from James Coons to do this debate review. I just want to point that out in every video so everybody can know, in case you started into a video, maybe you didn't start from part 1, maybe you just jump right into part 3 or something. I want everybody to know that I got permission from James Coons to do this video or do this debate review. All right, and of course this debate again is between Matt Dillahunty and Dr. Jonathan McLatchie. Also, another thing I forgot to mention is I got a bit of a cold, so if I'm coughing and stuff in the background, I'm sorry. It's unavoidable. It's more the weather than anything. It isn't like COVID-19 or I don't have breathing problems or anything. It's just coughing and times I'm not feeling well. And of course, I've got my little screen here over here on the side. The reason is because they're doing open dialogue. I don't want to cover Jonathan's face during this time because Jonathan's going to be speaking as well. It's going to be kind of odd because my attention focus is going to be down here in the right corner where the camera is, and it's just going to be a little awkward. But it's okay. It's better than covering Jonathan's face when he's trying to speak, and I'm trying to deal with his arguments and stuff. So, all right, let's jump into this.
Well, thanks so much, Matt. Let me just understand exactly the extent to which you will walk along the road with me where we depart company. Would you say that there's strong evidence that Jesus died on the cross or not?
No.
Okay, so What do you make of the testimonies in Paul and Acts and the Gospels?
I don't consider testimonies to be strong evidence. And then when you point to Paul right off the bat, was Paul there when Jesus died on the cross?
So you would.
All right. We're already getting into it. All right. He don't consider there strong evidence for Jesus crucifixion. Toward the end of the last debate review, I talked about his argument for or the last part of this debate review. I talked about his argument on, or at least his stance on Jesus crucifixion. He's willing to say that Jesus died only because he's willing to say he lived. Okay, he's not saying that he thinks there's strong evidence. This points to again a little bit further along those lines that he's just outright denied strong evidence for Jesus crucifixion, as you can just clearly see. And then you might think, oh, well, Matt's contradicting himself at this point. He's not really contradicting himself per se. What he's doing is he's only admitting that Jesus died by crucifixion, or at least died. I don't know if he thinks it's by crucifixion or not, but he thinks that Jesus died only because he's willing to admit that he lived. Okay, that's the reason why he thinks that he died. Okay, because like he's, said in his rebuttal, that's just the way life works. If someone lives, they die. So as a result, he's not actually saying that there's strong historical grounds. Now, understand this comes down to his epistemology because he denies testimony as evidence. All right. And so that's the reason. And historical sources are made of nothing but testimony. So he doesn't consider testimony to be evidence, or if he's willing to concede to it as evidence, he thinks it's weak evidence. And because of that, that's the reason why he's denying historical grounds. He's not saying, per se, that there are sources that say that Jesus died by crucifixion. He probably would admit that. But he doesn't think that would count as good evidence. It's ultimately what he's saying. Now, of course, in the mind of the historian, it counts as very strong evidence, in the mind of general population of Earth as well. Matt's argument of testimonies don't count as evidence, or it's not good evidence, it's pretty much isolated to him. Okay, historians don't make that distinction, neither do scientists or anyone else. Now, atheists who follow Matt seem to think, oh, well, that's just so obvious. Even though testimony is always considered evidence, it's considered evidence in a court of law. It's considered, in fact, eyewitness testimony in a court of law is considered direct evidence. It's not even considered circumstantial. It's considered direct evidence. So yes, testimony considered evidence. And in historical studies, early testimony that goes back early to the fact and multiple attestation and things like that are considered strong evidence. Matt don't think it's strong evidence. It's probably why he's not a historian. He don't think it's strong evidence, but it is strong evidence. Now, for Jesus' crucifixion, we have a number of sources that testify to Jesus' death by crucifixion, including non-Christian sources. So you can't accuse them of Christian bias or anything like that, because Josephus reports twice on Jesus and once on Jesus' crucifixion, specifically saying that he died by crucifixion, that he was crucified. And Tacitus also referenced Jesus' crucifixion. He said that that Christus, which is Latin for Christ, it's the Latin word for Christ, he said Christus suffered the extreme penalty under the reign of Tiberius Caesar. Tacitus is writing in very early 2nd century. He had lived in 1st century, but he was writing very early 2nd century. And also he was a Roman official and had access to Roman records. So this is, in fact, Tacitus is actually regarded as the greatest of Roman historians. Then, of course, we also have the Jewish Talmud. Granted, the Jewish Talmud was written in AD 200, but it does have a section called the Mishnah, the interpretation of the law, which goes all the way back to AD 70. He believed to go all the way back to AD 70. So it has some early information in it pertaining to Jesus' death by crucifixion, which Jewish Talmud says, on the eve of Passover, Yeshua, which is the Hebrew word for Joshua, The Greek equivalent is Iesus, which is Jesus in English. So he says, or the Talmud says, on the eve of Passover, Yeshua was hanged. Hanged, of course, is a Jewish idiom for crucifixion. It's one of the Jewish idioms. There's a couple. That was one of them. To be hanged, to be stretched with your hands, to be lifted up. All these are idioms for crucifixion in the Jewish culture, especially of first and second century. All right. In addition to that, we also have Lucian. He's a pagan and a critic of Christianity, and he referenced Jesus' crucifixion twice, not once, twice. Lucian's writing also in very early second century, and he mentions Jesus' crucifixion on 2 different occasions. He says that the Christians are worshiping their crucified sage. That's what Lucian said. This is a non-Christian source. This is not a Christian source. All right. There's also Barmara Serpion, who also mentions Jesus' crucifixion. And, well, not his crucifixion, excuse me, his death. He doesn't mention the crucifixion of Jesus, but he does mention the death. He mentioned that Jesus had died. He said that that the Jews had put to death their wise king, or murdered their wise king. I think one translation says murder. All right. In addition to non-Christian sources, we have a number of Christian sources, even early ones. First Clement, for example, Clement of Rome, written by a disciple of Peter, is writing in first century. You got Polycarp, you got Ignatius, or Justin Martyr. You know, you got all these other apologists that are writing on this as well. And of course, you have the Gospels. Even if you don't like the Gospels, even if you don't agree with the Gospels, even if you have some sort of theological, anti-theological bias against the Gospels, it makes no difference. All 4 Gospels were written in the first century, and they all 4 testify to that Jesus died by crucifixion. Again, I'm not looking at this like inerrant or inspired documents. I'm saying that the Gospels were written in first century. They are first century literatures, in which case all 4 Gospels testify to Jesus' death by crucifixion. All of them. Jesus' death by crucifixion is part of the pre-Markan Passion narrative, which is considered dated to within 7 years of Jesus' crucifixion. Within 7 years. The crucifixion is also mentioned in the early creed in 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians is one of the 7 undisputed epistles of Paul. In 1 Corinthians creed, we discussed that, I think on maybe the last video we talked about it. But it dates within 5 years of Jesus' crucifixion. Within 5 years, less than 5 years. And you can actually trace the creed with reason within a couple of years of Jesus' crucifixion. I've heard Bar Ehrman puts it within a year of Jesus' crucifixion. We're talking about really early information. Now, the 1 Corinthians 15 creed, it starts out with Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. That's what it starts off with. His death, burial, and resurrection. Within a few years of the event, referencing it. So the evidence for Jesus' crucifixion is just really, really strong. Now, of course, this video is not specifically about Jesus' crucifixion, but I want you to understand, even though Matt doesn't consider testimony and historical sources as strong evidence, they are strong evidence, and it is recognized by historians as strong evidence. So we've got a number of Christian documents, the New Testament, and outside of the New Testament that testifies to Jesus' crucifixion. We've got a number of non-Christian sources that testify to Jesus' crucifixion. By the way, I don't think I actually was exhausted with the non-Christian sources. I mentioned Josephus, I mentioned Tacitus, I mentioned Lucian, Jewish Talmud, Marlborough Serpion. Yeah, well, actually, there's another source. It's more indirect, more secondhand, because of the fact, and historians do accept secondhand sources. I talked about that, I think maybe in video part one of the series. But they do accept secondhand sources. It's not as strong as firsthand. I agree. Obviously, historians would rather have firsthand sources, but they do accept them. They do utilize them and quote from them and so forth. But the source is basically Julius Africanus, writing around 8200, had quoted a source, a non-Christian source, in the first century. And since he's responding to him and even disagreeing with him, because this is Thales he's quoting from 8052, and Thales thinks that the darkness around Jesus' crucifixion was a natural occurrence. And he says, no, I think it was a supernatural occurrence because it's physically impossible for, an eclipse of the sun to happen around this time and that sort of thing. And so he disagrees with him. So this puts viability to the source. He's quoting the source correctly. I mean, he's actually saying, okay, here's the source. Here's the source. I don't agree with what this source is saying, but this is what the source said. Okay. So in any given case, he quotes Thales, and Thales is talking about the darkness around Jesus' crucifixion. And this would be an indirect non-Christian source for Jesus' crucifixion. Now there might be other non-Christian sources. I'm not quite aware of that. That's the ones that I have on some of the sources that I've studied. But it is pretty good. And then combine that with the Christian sources. I'm a historian. I'm going to accept either Christian or non-Christian sources. I think it's biased or discriminative and bias of me to sit there and pick and choose which sources I accept based on whether I agree with their worldview or not. I don't think that's responsible historical methodology. So, of course, I'm going to accept Christian sources just the same way I'm going to accept non-Christian sources. And we have a number of Christian sources. We have a number of non-Christian sources. And this is outside the New Testament. And, of course, we have the New Testament itself, which also accounts for Jesus' crucifixion. The vast majority of the New Testament reference Jesus' death and crucifixion. And you got to remember, these books were independently written in the first century. We went over that. I remember us going over that. Because Matt keeps on treating this like it's one source when it's multiple sources that we have. All right. He also mentions testimony. Okay, we talked a little bit about the testimony as evidence, and historians consider testimony as evidence. And now, of course, that doesn't guarantee the proposition. Evidence just supports the proposition, doesn't guarantee it, but it is evidence. And it doesn't mean we won't consider other factors, such as is the testimony early? Is it from a reliable source? Is the testimony viable? Is it something that meets the other things that we know about the situation of context? I mean, all these things are going to be factors that we're going to consider as we're evaluating testimony. Okay. Before I paused it, Matt was getting on an argument from silence that he makes with Paul. Now, he doesn't specifically say it here. He will say it later as they're talking about it, or maybe even here. Actually, he might say it here because I think Jonathan challenges him on it. It was in a previous video where he also brought it up that he doesn't say it there. But this is where he's going to say it. This is where he's going to argue from silence. And how he argues from silence is he don't think Paul was there because Paul doesn't say he was there. The fact that Paul doesn't say he was there doesn't mean he wasn't there. But let's, this is a whole line of conversation. So I'm going to let him finish that before I fully respond to this argument from silence.
To dismiss all testimony.
No, I didn't say I would dismiss all testimony. Was Paul there when Jesus was supposedly killed on a cross?
We don't know.
Okay, do we have any reason to think that Paul was there?
No, but he may have been, we don't know.
Yeah, and if Paul was there, don't you think Paul would have said, I was there? Isn't that really plausible?
But Paul does mention that.
All right. Matt is setting up what's called an argument from silence, which are inherently weak arguments. Basically, it's an argument from silence is an argument that claims that something is not true on the basis of no evidence that it is true. It's outright dogmatic statement. Now, an old dictum, which goes back, I don't know how long, but it probably to ancient times. Rhetoric goes back pretty far in ancient history. But an old dictum states that whoever whoever makes the assertion bears the burden of proof. Now, Matt usually tries to be very careful not to make dogmatic assertions. He'll throw out general possibilities, and when you challenge one of these possibilities, he'll retract and say he doesn't take any of them. Okay. I often describe him like a turtle that gets caught with his head and arms out, and then when he feels threatened or challenged, he pulls it back in, in his shell to try to protect himself from being successfully challenged. But the fact of the matter is, we're gonna throw those possibilities out there and expect people to challenge it. Of course, the mere possibility that something be true doesn't make it true. Same thing for it. Mere possibility that it might not be true doesn't make it not true. So, but in either case, Matt has a tendency to do that. But with Paul, for some reason, I don't know if it's because he feels a little bit more confident making an argument because Barman makes it, but I don't know. Barman, of course, he's very open about logical fallacies. He just kind of just makes logical fallacies, don't care that he's making them or being accused of making them. He just does it anyhow. It doesn't bother him. It bothers Matt, but I don't know what bothers him more, making the logical fallacy or being accused of it. But he is making a logical fallacy. He's making the argument from silence fallacy, also known as ignatum argumentum, or argument, ignatum argumentum, argument from ignorance. Basically, it is a fallacy in logic, and my opinion of it is it's an inherently weak argument, which means by its nature, it's weak, by its nature. And these kinds of arguments always stick out like a sore thumb. They always stick out like a sore thumb. You can't hide from them. You can deny them if you want to, but it exposes a kind of a dishonesty when you sit there and deny something that is so obvious to everybody when they're watching the debates and they can see that you are arguing that it's true or that it's not true because there's no evidence that it is true. And Matt typically tries to be very subtle when he's arguing from silence. This one, he just kind of blatantly does it. Now, if you don't deny an argument from silence, what other recourse could you take? Well, one recourse is to try to justify it. Well, one way to justify it is to say, well, it's difficult to prove a negative, which is true. It is difficult to prove a negative, but that don't necessarily mean that alleviates any burden of proof, your responsibility to prove what you're saying, just because it's difficult to prove a negative. Some people say it's impossible to prove a negative. There are only certain negatives that I would say that would be true. The proving the non-existence of something, for example, is impossible to do. You can't prove that. But some negatives, like whether something happened or not, you can prove that. Someone can prove it historically through historical sources if historical sources deny something and it's reliable and early and so forth. And so you can prove negatives historically as far as that goes. They're hard to prove. Don't get me wrong. They're still difficult to prove. But that doesn't mean it automatically alleviates your responsibility of proving it. Now, another way of doing it is that some trying to get around an argument for silence is to try to, or justify at least, some people think that an argument for silence would increase in strength if there is good reasons for expectation of evidence. And I would probably say I mostly agree with that. It would increase some strength. That doesn't necessarily make the argument very strong. I mean, when you're talking about inherently weak argument, they may maybe a little bit stronger if there's a strong expectation. But even then, there would have to be a very, very strong expectation, very good reasons for believing an that expecting evidence when there isn't any. Does Matt have a strong expectation of evidence? Well, he thinks it's more plausible that if Paul was there at Jesus' crucifixion, he would have said that he was there at Jesus' crucifixion. The problem with this is that okay, first of all, it's not more plausible that he would have said it. I mean, he's not defending the crucifixion in the first place. Everybody just kind of generally understood that Jesus died by crucifixion, and nobody was questioning that or challenging that. So there's no reason he had to prove Jesus died by crucifixion to any of these people. So there's no reason for him to have said that. Secondly, I don't think it's more plausible that he would have said he was there if he was there. I think it's actually more plausible that he was there at Jesus' crucifixion. I'm not saying that I'm affirming that he was there. I don't know. Like Jonathan, I don't know if he was there, but I think it's plausible that he was there. Paul says in Philippians that he was a former Pharisee, and Pharisees were high up on the religious ladder. He said that he was a Hebrew of the Hebrews. In layman's terms, he was saying, I'm a Jew's Jew, is ultimately what he's saying. So if he was as Jewish as they come, is what Paul was saying. Combine that with the fact he was a Pharisee, the fact that Jesus died around Passover, Paul would have been in Jerusalem at the time that Jesus died by crucifixion. Add that to the fact that Jesus' death by crucifixion, or any crucifixion, was a public execution. In fact, that was part of the punishment of crucifixion, is that they were publicly humiliated in front of others as an example of what would happen if you mess with Rome. So, yeah, I think it's far more plausible that he was there at Jesus' crucifixion than he would have mentioned it. Now, if you had one of the letters that Paul's writing in, like say 1 Corinthians, for example, and the people there were denying that Jesus died by crucifixion, or questioning it and challenging it, and then Paul was trying to say, yes, he did die by crucifixion, and he doesn't mention at that point that he was there, then I would say that would increase that probability. That would increase the strength of his argument. But there is no situation like that, at least not in the New Testament. So we don't have that. So I don't think there's any good reasons for thinking Paul was there, or Paul was not there. I'm not saying he was. I'm saying it's more plausible that he was, historically. Probable, I don't know. There's no evidence for it, so I don't know. I'm not going to make a dogmatic assertion because I don't know. But that don't mean he wasn't. Marco Polo, for example, went throughout all of China and didn't once mention the Great Wall of China. I mean, this thing is so huge, you could see it literally from space. It's the only man-made structure you can see from space. And he doesn't mention it once in his writings. Does that mean he didn't know about it? No. Does it mean he wasn't aware of it? No. Does it mean he was never there with it? No. It just means he didn't feel compelled to write it down because everybody knew it existed. Like I said, it was so big, everyone could see it. So if Paul's writing to people that already know that Jesus died by crucifixion, why would he need to prove it to them? He wouldn't. And by the way, Jonathan's going to go that it's not really relevant to his argument whether Paul was there or not, and I agree. Because here's the thing. Paul's reference to Jesus' crucifixion doesn't require him to be there physically. Let him talk for a minute about that, and I'll finish my response on that.
He does mention the testimony of Peter and James, and
yeah, that's not what I asked.
Well,
Okay, Jonathan, if you were there and you witnessed Jesus' death on the cross and you then wrote about him, wouldn't, or, you know, a decade or a couple of decades later, would you say that you went and talked to the other apostles and you did all this stuff? Or would you just say, I was there, I saw the man die?
Okay.
All right. Like I said, it's not relevant to the argument that Paul was there. By the way, we can't place Tacitus in Rome during the fire AD 64. He could have been there. We don't know. We can't place him in Rome like we can place Josephus in Jerusalem during the destruction of Jerusalem AD 70. We can't place Tacitus historically in Rome during the fire in AD 64. Tacitus probably, there's a question of when Tacitus was born, but most historians think that he would have been about 8 or 9 years old during the time of the fire in Rome in AD 64. We don't know if he was actually there. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. But historians will still consider what he says about the fire in Rome to be accurate. I mean, he's a Roman official. He has access to Roman records. There's no reason to doubt him just because he wasn't physically there to see the fire. The fact that he wasn't physically there doesn't mean he doesn't have accurate or reliable information. He's writing closer to the facts than what we are, and that's what historians is going to look at. All right, I'm going to back up to a point that I missed here in my notes. He says Matt had said that he doesn't dismiss all testimony. Understand something. Matt is very inconsistent. One minute he'll say testimonial claims and claims are not evidence. And in the next minute he'll say, well, yeah, testimony counts as some form of evidence, but it's weak evidence. In fact, his supporters in the comment section, I often find them to be inconsistent because one time I heard, that they'll say, well, claims are evidence, and it's so obvious that it should be that way, even though testimony has always been considered evidence. And then next minute you got his supporters saying, oh, well, it's evidence, it's just weak evidence. In other words, you got people that support Matt's position here, and they're confused about which one it is. Is it evidence or is it not evidence? It's just because Matt is inconsistent. One minute he will argue it's not evidence, and next minute he will argue that it's evidence in some sense, but he thinks it's weak evidence, which it is not. Historically, it is considered strong evidence. We already discussed the plausibility of Paul being there at Jesus' crucifixion. All right, he mentions Paul. If he was really there at Jesus' crucifixion, then why does he say he went to go talk to disciples? This is completely false. For start with, the issue wasn't over Jesus' crucifixion directly anyhow. It was just over the gospel in general when he went to talk to the disciples. But he was trying to prove to the Galatian Christians that the same gospel that he preached is the same one they preached. And he says, here's what he says. He says that he was in Arabia for 3 years. He didn't talk to the disciples during that time. He said he didn't see any of them. He said 3 years he was in Arabia. And then he said after 3 years, then I went to Jerusalem to meet with Peter and James, the brother of the Lord. And he says he saw no one else besides them. That's in Galatians 1. Galatians is one of the 7 undisputed epistles of Paul. He doesn't have to sit there and say that the reason he went to these apostles, Peter and James, wasn't to say, hey, I need to verify whether this is true or not. What he's saying is simply, I want to see if we're on the same page. In fact, the Greek word he uses when he says he meet with Peter is hysteresis, which is a fact-checking word. It basically just means it's an investigative term. It just means he went to see if what he's preaching is the same as what the apostles were preaching. Ultimately, that's what it is. Matt misunderstands apparently what Paul's talking about there, and misses the fact that he says that the first 3 years of him preaching, he stayed in Arabia and hadn't saw the apostles. So he didn't have to go to the apostles to see if it's true. he went to the apostles to see whether or not if they were on the same page. Okay, let's continue.
It doesn't matter for the sake of my argument that Paul was there. I don't think that the only good
Well,
evidence
it does if you're counting him as a witness, because if he wasn't there, then he's
No.
not a witness.
still count as evidence that he wasn't there. Because
What Jonathan's saying is absolutely correct. It still counts as evidence. I mentioned my example with Tacitus as well. But it still counts as evidence because Paul is writing very close to the fact. He knows the disciples personally. It doesn't matter whether he was there or not. When we cite him as a source for his crucifixion, we're not citing him as a witness per se. We're citing him as an early source, and he was close to the people that would have known for a fact that Jesus was crucified and so forth. And he was identified that Jesus did die by crucifixion. It doesn't matter whether he was there or not. Matt's just barking up the wrong tree on that argument.
It's not a witness. You just a minute ago suggested that Paul is a witness that we should listen to. And I'm saying I have no evidence that Paul's a witness.
Paul's a witness to what the disciples had said. And Jonathan is about to say that. And Matt keeps misrepresenting what he's saying.
But he is a witness to what was being proclaimed by the other apostles. In
Yes.
particular,
And I'm a witness, and
Well-
I'm a witness to what the National Enquirer reports about Elvis, but that doesn't mean I'm an actual witness about what's actually happened with Elvis.
All right. Okay, first of all, Jonathan's argument is that Paul knew what the disciples were claiming. He wasn't saying that he was a witness to what the apostles saw. Okay, this is just a straw man argument. That's not what he was trying to argue. Jonathan is obviously trying to articulate his argument so he can understand it, and Matt is intentionally just stretching or taking Jonathan's position completely out of what Jonathan's actually trying to argue. Just to have an argument to attack, but he's not attacking the right argument. And Jonathan's trying to get his argument out there so you understand what he's saying. He's not saying that Paul or was a witness to what the disciples saw. He's saying that Paul was a witness to what the apostles said they saw. Okay, that's what he's arguing. Secondly, Paul is an eyewitness to what he experienced as far as his resurrection appearance. He is an eyewitness to that. Matt doesn't accept that, but that is the case. He is an eyewitness to it. So his eyewitness testimony counts as evidence. 3, Paul is writing close to the fact, so he knew what the disciples were claiming. And this is what Jonathan is trying to argue. Oh yeah, and another thing is that Matt is making a categorical error with genres. He's saying, "Oh, I'm also a witness to what the National Enquirer claimed." The National Enquirer is a rag. It's a gossip tabloid. That's what it is. It's a gossip tabloid. Okay, which means they make money off of wild claims. And they even stretch the claims out. The weirder, the wilder, the more likely it didn't happen, the more entertaining the statement is, the more money they're going to make. And Matt is ultimately comparing that to the disciples who had nothing to gain from lying about it, and who said that they saw the raised Jesus, to what the National Enquirer says, which is not the same. The 4 Gospels aren't historical novels. 4 Gospels are Greco-Roman biographies. The testimony of Paul is within the epistles, within the letters he wrote to certain churches. Even if you discount 6 of those, 7 of his epistles are undisputed, as already mentioned. And so, yeah, again, Matt's barking up the wrong tree here. But the biggest thing to take out of this is that he's misrepresenting, in order to try to win the argument, he's misrepresenting Jonathan's argument. And Jonathan is trying his best to articulate that argument so you understand what he's actually trying to argue. And so Matt just kind of took it and ran with it in the direction of Matt Dillahunty's perceptions.
Oh,
Peter is someone who was present at the cross, we know, or present with Jesus' trial, rather. And James was the brother of Jesus, whom surely would have known that his own brother had died on the cross. And so I think that he is a credible secondhand report as to.
Don't have a report from Jesus' brother.
Well, what we have, if you think James is written by Jesus' brother, then we do.
But I don't necessarily think that. This
So
is
we
the
can make
problem.
This is one of the issues I have with Matt's argument. He has a tendency to dismiss things without rhyme or reason, just because he doesn't agree with it. Later, he will accuse Jonathan of doing this. We'll see that toward the end of this video, in fact, where he will accuse Jonathan of basically dismissing without rhyme or reason. But that's just not the case. Jonathan is not dismissing it without rhyme or reason. He's saying that, we have testimony, and let's look and see if this testimony is early, if it's coming from a reliable source, if there's any reason for them to lie about it, those kind of things. In fact, he's looking at all those things. He's looking at all those factors. Matt's saying, I don't agree with it, therefore it's not true, and I'm going to dismiss it. And I don't like that type of argumentation. That's called what I call dismissal arguments. Dismissal arguments, basically, in my definition of them, is basically any argument that dismisses the other arguments or evidence without any rhyme or reason. No evidential proof is being presented at all, and you're just basically dismissing it for number of reasons. Maybe you don't agree with it, maybe you think it's made up later, like in the case of legend or something of that nature. All legend hypotheses that don't have any evidential basis for it, such as if the source is really, really late or something of that nature, are usually dismissal arguments, because they just throw that in there because they don't agree with the statement. So they say it's just legend, without ever proving it. And so when you don't demonstrate what you're saying, but you're arguing in a way that says, I don't agree with it, therefore I'm not going to believe it, that's a dismissal argument. And he just did a dismissal argument with James. Did he give any credible reason why James, the brother of Jesus, didn't write the epistle of James? Now, we have evidence that he did, but I want to know, Matt just dismissed it. Okay, where's your demonstration of this? I mean, why don't you think James wrote it? I mean, he doesn't give it. Now, granted, this debate wasn't about authorship, and I'm willing to give Matt the benefit of the doubt on that. But the fact of the matter is that he has a habit of doing this. This is the point I want you to make, because throughout this debate, he has a habit of dismissing what the person's saying without rhyme or reason, just because he does not agree with it. And this is one of the examples of him doing that.
This is the problem of having a big storybook that has a bunch of different people trying to tell different parts of the same story, and no idea who any of them are, no way to investigate or find out.
Okay.
All right. This is a charge of inconsistency that I like to put toward Matt. He says, well, it's basically self-refuting. He says we have no way of investigating who wrote the text of the Bible, the big storybook. But how does he know they didn't write it? How does he know they didn't write it? Well, he doesn't. But he's claiming that they didn't write it. Well, how does he know? If you can't investigate something, then you should not be able to affirm or deny the thing in question. You just can't, if you can't investigate it. If there's no way of knowing one way or the other, which is ultimately what he's saying. But yet he's denying authorship. He's saying they didn't write it, is what he ultimately said. And of course, we already dealt with the anonymity thing. Scholars call something anonymous when the text itself does not identify the author. When the text itself does not identify the author. That's what they call anonymous. If the text identifies the author, but we don't think, now I think I've already dealt with this in the previous video, but we don't think that that person wrote it, like we might have a number of evidence against them writing it, then we classify that, we categorize that as pseudepigraphy, which is a big fancy Greek word that means false title or falsely ascribed. And if Matt's saying, well, I just, yes, their names are on a lot of these books, but I don't think that person wrote it. Okay, then it wouldn't be categorized as anonymous. So, and again, he's treating the Bible like it's one book, one source, instead of multiple sources. I think there's one point in there where he does actually will treat it as multiple sources, because he'll talk about it being a collection of sources. And so that's the one time throughout this entire debate where he actually seems to concede to that. The rest of the time, he treats it like it's a single source. In fact, a lot of times he won't even treat it like written by one person that you don't know who wrote it, sort of thing. When it's a collection of sources written by a number of authors. I think about 40 writers had their hand into the writing of the Bible, if you accept the traditional authorships, of course. Or actually 40 plus. I think it's maybe over 40. All right. Well, scholars do have a way to investigate authorship. Okay. They do so through evidence. They do it through internal evidence. They do it through external evidence. They do it through manuscript evidence. They do it through historical sources. In fact, most sources are actually anonymous. Most sources are anonymous. And the way in which historians know who wrote it is by looking at what other historical sources say who wrote it. That's how they understand who wrote it. All right. Like say Plutarch, example. Plutarch's considered the greatest of all Roman biographers. He wrote more biographies than any other historian I'm aware of. And he wrote biographies ranging from hundreds of years before his own time to near contemporaneous ones, people that lived close to his own time and lived close to each other. And for the later, these are known as the parallel lives of Plutarch. But all of Plutarch's biographies, Plutarch never once identifies his name. He never once did. Then how do ancient historians know that Plutarch, and including Plutarch scholars, know that Plutarch wrote those books? Because other ancient sources attributed authorship to him. Yeah. And so everyone pretty much agrees that Plutarch wrote those works, even though his name doesn't appear in it. So we do have a way to investigate it. So the statement that we have no way to investigate it is wrong anyhow. Even if the text does not say who wrote it, we know who wrote it from the evidence. Now, of course, we look at external evidence and the internal evidence. Now, of course, understand something. Sometimes people like Matt and Bartram and so forth would cherry pick the data. And they'll say, well, the Gospels don't say they're written by Matthew, Mark, and John. There's a reason why they're saying that way. Because even though the Gospels might not identify Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, sources outside the Bible does. They're intentionally ignoring external evidence. Because evidence is not just internal evidence. Evidence is also external. Because you got two categories of evidence, internal evidence and external evidence. And these can even be broken down even further into direct and indirect evidence. And we have a number of indirect evidence within the Gospels that seems to suggest those particular traditional authors. And then we have a number of direct evidence, explicit. Direct evidence is very explicit on who wrote the Gospels. Now, you might not like it or agree with it, but the evidence is still there. And this is just how we can tell. But Matt's statement, we have no way to investigate it, is completely false. It is completely false. For someone like Bart Ehrman, for example, he rejects, except for the 7 undisputed epistles of Paul, he rejects all the traditional authorship. He even rejects Mark, even though most scholars do accept it. John Mark wrote Mark. He rejects all. He rejects all the traditional authorship. Even in the case of Bart Ehrman. But when Bart Ehrman does this, he basically denies their authorship. He dogmatically says they did not write. How would he know that? Even if let's assume that Bart was telling the truth or was accurate on what he's saying. How would he know that at all if we couldn't investigate? Because you couldn't assert that we couldn't know it either if we can't investigate it. So that's just completely false. There's a way to investigate it. People dialogue about the authorships all the time. And Matt, he has a debate, all modern day debate. It might happen after this one, but he has it with Jonathan Sheffield. And I want to do a debate review video on that too, because authorship of the Gospels is something I've investigated quite a bit of on. But he knows that there's external evidence. He might reject it. He might. Now, of course, in Matt's view, he wouldn't consider historical sources as either evidence or good evidence because it relies on testimony, and he doesn't think testimony should count as evidence, or he'll reject it entirely as evidence, or he'll reject it as strong evidence. Either way, he doesn't regard it as something that's going to convince somebody of something. And so we have these sources that say that, but he doesn't agree with them. So ultimately, he knows these sources of existence. So I don't know really the charge of cherry picking is intentional on his part because he's aware of these sources, yes. And in some degree, you can say he's intentionally cherry picking. But the thing is that he doesn't recognize these historical sources as evidence that it's true. And he doesn't recognize that. So in his mind, he doesn't think he's cherry picking because he doesn't think there's any external evidence at all, even though there's sources he knows say this, because he doesn't recognize these sources as evidence. And so in his mind, he thinks he's not cherry picking. But the reality is he is cherry picking because this is considered evidence. All right, let's continue.
So you wouldn't, so I mean, take the book of Acts, for example. You think, so the author of Luke Acts was someone who was a traveling companion of Paul, who has ample access to the witnesses in Jerusalem. Sorry?
Paul or Peter, because I thought it was Paul too, and then a minute ago you said Peter, and I just want to make sure it wasn't Peter.
I'm sorry, I misspoke if I did. I said Luke was a traveling companion of Paul,
yeah,
and had ample access to the treasure trove of living witnesses in Jerusalem. And because he was present with Paul in Jerusalem.
Well, I think that's a really flawed assumption to assume that there was a treasure trove of witnesses. How do you know there was a treasure trove of witnesses? Doesn't that presume that the events being reported were true? And isn't that the very thing we're trying to prove? And therefore that claim is a fundamentally circular argument.
No.
All right. Okay, some errors here. All right, let's talk about the treasure trove of witnesses first. The 1 Corinthians 15 creed counts as a treasure trove of witnesses. Just because we don't have, see, what Matt's trying to argue is that he wants that the witnesses themselves to testify to what they saw. And Paul is presenting this creed here. And so he thinks, oh, well, this is just Paul presenting this information. But that's inaccurate because halfway at least, it is Paul presenting this information. It is Paul presenting this creed. But the creed itself does not originate with Paul. This is the point that, at least in Bart Ehrman's debate with William Lane Craig, he just didn't get. I mean, he knew that this creed didn't originate with Paul. He knew this creed goes back to early, and he knew that. He knew that. But he seemed to keep on saying, oh, well, Paul's writing 1 Corinthians in the mid-50s, and maybe it was just in the process, talking about Bart Ehrman, maybe this was just in the process of doing the debate. But, you know, going back and forth from that sort of thing. But Will and Craig ended up getting up and pointing out the fact that this creed goes back really early. The point of it, the emphasis of it, the force of this creed is that it does not originate with Paul. Paul is getting it from somewhere. He didn't invent this creed. He didn't invent this creed when he wrote 1 Corinthians. okay, in the mid-50s, AD 55. He didn't invent this creed. He got it from somewhere. Where did Paul get it? Well, Paul, and I think I mentioned this in the previous video, but Paul mentions Peter and James. That's a huge hint to where he's getting this creed. Huge. Because that would mean that, because creeds usually didn't have specific names within them, a specific identification like that. They usually were summaries, generalized, and that sort of thing. But this had a specific, two specific names, James and Peter, that wasn't mentioned in the creed. They're the only ones mentioned in the creed. Now, after he presents his creed, Paul also tells us whether it was I or they, so we preach and so you believe. Whether it was I or they. Who is the they there? Well, the last group of parents that was mentioned in the creed was the 12, an early title for the disciples. So he's saying, whether you're hearing this from the disciples or me, you're hearing the same thing. Well, how did Paul know that the apostles were preaching the same thing that he did? Unless he has previously checked it out. Galatians 1 and 2 tells us about meetings that he had with the disciples, specifically Peter and James. In chapter 1, he tells us, okay, like I mentioned already, he was 3 years in Arabia, and then he goes up to Jerusalem, and he says he met with Peter and James, a brother of the Lord, and no one else was present there. Peter and James was the ones present there. And of course, I mentioned this already. The Greek word he uses for meet with Peter, meet or visit there in that context, is the Greek word hysteresis, which is an investigative term. It's actually where we got our English word history from. But it's an investigative term. So he went up there to see if him and the disciples were on the same page. Now, he says in chapter 2 of Galatians, he said that 14 years afterwards, we don't know if this is after his conversion or 14 years after this meeting, but he says 14 years later, he says he goes back up and he met with Peter and James again. Peter and James was there also. But this time, John and Barnabas was also there. And he said that they gave him and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, which is where we get that term. And then he says that that they added nothing to me. What does that mean? It means that they said that Paul was preaching everything that they were preaching. Now, chapter 1 of Galatians, within 5 years of Jesus' crucifixion, this is why scholars think that Paul received his creed at this point from either Peter or James. This means we can actually, and by them giving it to Paul, they were rubber stamping what this creed said. So we do have a treasure trove of witnesses. Just because we don't have the witnesses themselves saying this, doesn't mean we don't have a treasure trove of witnesses. We have a creed, an early creed, that goes right back to the very mouth of the disciples themselves. And I would call this, historically speaking, this is powerful evidence. I think one historian actually said this is the kind of thing that historians drool over. Of course, I'm not going to drool over it, but it is very, very strong evidence. Historians do give credit to what Paul has said, or what if Paul says that this is what the disciples were claiming, and he was in a position to know what they were claiming, then this would show, and this is the point that Jonathan is trying to make, that he's not saying that Paul said disciples and that proved what disciples claim is true. That's not what Jonathan's trying to argue. He's trying to argue that Paul is a witness to what the disciples were claiming, and that he can verify that this is what disciples were preaching. That's what he's saying. That's all he's saying. That's the point that he's making. And Matt keeps trying to make a beeline for the resurrection. Well, that don't prove what the disciples saw was true. He didn't say that. He said it proved that they were claiming it, that they were at least testifying to the fact that this is what actually took place. And that's what Jonathan is trying to say. All right. He says that it's a fundamental circular argument to assume that the innocent until proven guilty, believing a source is innocent until proven guilty of a source. And it says, besides, this is in itself self-refuting. Okay, that's what I said in my notes. It's self-refuting argument. It's not a fundamental circular argument. It's actually self-refuting, because if innocent to proven guilty is a fundamental circular argument, then so would guilty to proven innocent, which is what Matt is assuming. Historical methodology, proper, accurate historical methodology, is that the historians give the benefit of the doubt to the text. To put it in layman's terms, they consider it innocent to proven guilty. This is just proper, responsible historical methodology. Now, of course, skeptics don't practice responsible historical methodology. They consider every source to be guilty to proven innocent. I'm not saying that you can't investigate it and consider, supporting evidence for it, or to accept all testimony uncritically, that you don't critically evaluate the arguments properly. You can do all those things. The object of it, though, is that we don't just jump around and assume everybody who tells us anything is just lying to us, but it's not a circular argument to accept testimony. Especially, and it's not a circular argument to have to explain data. This is what historians do. I mean, what do you think historians, and not just historians, scientists do this? How do you explain this data? We have this data. How do you explain it? This is not a circular argument. To require explanation, and actually, the first time I ever heard this objection, Matt's not the one who invented this objection. I don't usually hear it. You don't hear it from the scholarly community or the historical community. It's usually done from the layman's community. But the first time I heard it was from a guy that was trying, I don't know if he was a scientist or just scientifically minded. I don't know what the case was. He wasn't a historian, that's sure. And he was debating Mike Licona on the resurrection. And he tried to accuse Mike because Mike wanted to because he has this data and he wants the best explanation for that data. And he tried to word the fallacy, or word his argument in a way that makes it commit the fallacy. And Matt's doing the same thing. He's rewording it to make it sound like he commits the fallacy. The problem, however, to explain the data is not a circular argument. It's not a circular argument, because that's what people do, actually. We do explain the data. I mean, what are we supposed to do? Not investigate anything at all? You got evidence, you got facts, but we're not supposed to come up with any kind of explanation, or we're arguing in a circle. No, we're not. A circular argument is when you assume your conclusion first. Your conclusion is assumed in your premise. It's presupposed. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that we can't have presuppositions. We all have presuppositions. The issue, however, is whether or not, if you argue your presuppositions in a circle, in what's called a vicious circle, where there's no proving anything. There's no evidence. There's just your assumptions, and that's it. So the fact that you want to explain something is not a circular argument, because he's not assuming his conclusion. He's granting that we have facts, we have evidence. Let's explain this data. Matt's saying, oh, I don't need to explain anything because I think you're arguing in a circle. No, Jonathan is not arguing in a circle. In fact, it's very reasonable to want an explanation for data that we have. And this is the kind of thing that we see, not just among historians, but this is the kind of thing we see even among scientists. If you have a black hole and you try to prove it's a black hole, because you can't actually see a black hole. All we can see is evidence for a black hole. We can see matter swirling around a spot that we cannot see. Okay? And, it's basically black spot. That's how black holes get their name. And so when scientists see that, they can't see a black hole because it absorbs light into it, and so you can't see it. But we can see evidence of a black hole. And so the scientist infers from the data, because that's what they're doing. They're trying to explain the data. Now, Matt said in the last video that we looked at, Matt tried to say, well, why am I trying to explain this? Well, why would you have to explain anything if, it's just a circle of reasoning to try to explain it? Obviously, trying to explain data is not a circular argument. It has never been considered a circular argument. Matt is committing a fallacious reasoning by trying to reword that argument to make it look like Jonathan is making a logical fallacy. He is not making. And I think that needs to come out, because explaining data is what we do in any discipline. We want to explain the data. We want to explain the evidence. We want to explain the phenomenon that we're observing, that we're witnessing, that we're seeing, that we're investigating, that these facts that we have. Yes, that's just the way in which historians do history. It's the way scientists do science. It's the way human beings operate. We need to explain the data. It's not a circle of reasoning. It is just sound investigative methodology. We must explain what we know.
Because so I think part of the problem in your epistemology is you make this distinction between a claim and evidence, and
Yes.
you made this a number of your debates, and I totally disagree with that approach.
You're wrong.
Because a claim is evidence.
No, it's not.
To be explained.
It's no. A claim is not evidence. If I say I have a $100 bill in my wallet, that's a claim. It is a statement about a fact. It is not evidence in and of itself.
It's more probable on the hypothesis that you do. Especially, I mean, if you are,
I don't care about more.
This is so listen to me. Matt, listen to me. Especially if you are a trusted friend who has a track record of being habitually reliable, habitually truthful, then if I come to you and you say to me, I have $100 in my pocket or what have you, then that is something I'm going to believe you on, right? So that is a form of evidence.
I completely agree with you, and you just demonstrated how your objection is fundamentally flawed in my epistemology is sound. Because what you cited was the evidence for my likelihood to reliably tell you the truth. You're using, here's the claim. My claim is I have $100 in my wallet. That is not evidence. What you're using is your understanding of how reliable and trustworthy I am. That is the evidence that supports whether or not my claim is likely to be true.
All right. I allowed him to go a little bit further than I normally would. I've got like 3 different points in my notes on that. All right. Let's discuss the claims, not evidence. I promised you in the last video that we would get to this. This is the point where we're getting to it. I originally did this PowerPoint presentation. I was trying to do a PowerPoint presentation on the whole claims not evidence argument, which is one of his prize arguments. And I decided this was so good that I was going to present that as a separate video. I don't know if I'm going to be working on it. I thought about working on it while I was, doing, because I'm almost done with it. And present it to YouTube or upload it to YouTube after I get done with this video or possibly my next one, to the open dialogue. But then again, I might wait until after I'm completely done with the debate review that I'm doing. But I decided to save the PowerPoint presentation for that particular video. But I am going to go over essentially or basically where the errors you made. Now, understand something. Matt is a very inconsistent person. One minute he'll sit there and say that something is a claim, it's not evidence. And then next minute he'll say, oh, well, it's some form of evidence. It's anecdotal evidence, meaning it's an evidence by source. But he thinks that that's weak evidence. So he's inconsistent. One minute, something can't be both evidence and not evidence, because in the later, it's still considered evidence, even if you think it's weak. It can't be both evidence and not evidence. That's just a direct contradiction. So if Matt sticks with his claim, the claims are not evidence. If he sticks with that consistently, if he consistently holds it, even if he doesn't consistently hold it, every time he argues this, he's committing these errors. Okay? He won't consistently hold to it because he'll bounce right back to, oh, well, it's some form of evidence. It's just weak evidence. It's just not sufficient enough, and that sort of thing. And that requires a different response to this one. I want to point that out so you understand that I'm not misunderstanding his argument, because in fact his claims not evidence argument is a very popular argument of his. It's his prize argument. It's the one he's best known for. I'm not misrepresenting him at all. Okay, and I'm not trying to straw man him. I'm not trying to say. You say, yeah, but doesn't he recognize testimony? Yes, because he's inconsistent. One minute he's denying it as evidence, and the next minute he's acknowledging it as evidence. Now, when he makes the other argument, okay, when he's making the other argument, he's not making these errors. He's making a different problem, it has a different response with it, okay? But it requires a different response, okay? This response is only if he's arguing claims, not evidence. He's not very consistent on it. He will bounce back to the other argument. But this is the thing that he argues through most of this debate, the debate review I'm doing on this debate. He argues most of it. He pretty much argued almost in the entirety. I think he made like one statement that he bounced back to, testimony being weak evidence, where he accepted as evidence weak, that sort of thing. In his debate with Mike Winger on capturing Christianity. But he argued mostly, for the most part, in that video even, almost the entirety, where he would just argue claim that evidence. In this one, he argues it most of the time. Now, I think I found maybe 3 references where he does actually switch back to the other argument. And when he does, that requires a different response than what I'm giving here. And what I'm giving here is only for his claims, not evidence argument only. Okay. And I tell you all that so people know that I'm not misrepresenting him. I'm not misunderstanding what he says. Rather, it's just the fact that Matt is not a very consistent person, and he will bounce back to the other argument. But like I said, testimony can't be both evidence and not evidence. It's just not possible. And I would even challenge Matt to pick one or the other. Stop bouncing back and forth like that. Either is it evidence or not evidence. If it's evidence and you say, well, it's weak evidence, then we can deal with that and identify whether it's sufficient enough to prove the thing trying to be proved. But if you're arguing that it's not evidence, like in a claims not evidence argument, then this is the response I have for that. All right. It commits 3 errors, 3 problems. It has 3 problems in it. Okay. I'm gonna identify this as now it's going to be reversed. It's going to be reversed in my PowerPoint presentation because of the way I worded it there. But I wanted to do the logical problem last. So I just kind of flipped it. So it's factually inaccurate, for one. It has a rhetorical problem. So it's got a factual problem, rhetorical problem, and a logical problem. All right. Let's deal with the factual problem first. First of all, it's factually incorrect. Okay. A lot of the atheists in the comment sections of this video and other debate review videos, they're like, it should be so obvious that claims should not count as evidence. And yet, It's not obvious because, for one thing, testimony has always been considered evidence. Always. And if testimony is considered evidence, why would it be obvious that it's not evidence? Beginning of the legal system in this country and every nation, they always have testimony as evidence, especially eyewitness testimony. In our legal system, the testimony of the testimony is eyewitness testimony is considered direct evidence in our legal system. Direct evidence. This is recognized by a lawyer and a judge. He's a judge and a lawyer, and his name is Graham Smith from Britain. And a book titled "Was the Tomb Empty?" And he identified eyewitness testimony as, in fact, he goes through evidences that in court of law, that sort of thing, and he says that eyewitness testimony is considered direct evidence. It's considered evidence. And so you got that, and you got the fact that scientists consider it evidence, historians consider it evidence. You know, why doesn't it matter? It is not factually accurate to claim that testimony don't count as evidence. It's always been considered evidence. Does that guarantee? Now, of course, Matt's view of evidence appears that he wants the proposition guaranteed. That's part of his epistemology. It's a flawed epistemology. I'll discuss that in a second. But he wants it guaranteed to him. And if it's not guaranteed, it can be evidence. But evidence doesn't require it to be guaranteed, the proposition. It just simply supports the proposition. The truthfulness of the proposition supports it. And obviously, the better the evidence, the more evidence you have, all those things just kind of stacks up in favor of it. All right, now it's factually inaccurate. That's the factual problem. The second problem is a rhetorical problem. It is actually contradictory. This is recognized in debate reviews, such as the debate review that Mike Winger does of his debate with Matt Dillahunty, as well as a debate review of that same debate done by Cameron from Capturing Christianity, who hosted the debate between Mike Winger and Matt Dillahunty. And he goes on well, it wasn't really officially a debate review. It was more dealing with his specific argument on claims not evidence, in which case both him and Mike Winger recognized that Matt's argument was literally self-refuting. It is self-refuting. Because if you make a claim that claims are evidence, then the statement claims not evidence itself is a claim. So why should I believe it? Why is atheist using his assertions on this as proof that that's the case? It can't be used as evidence, can it? Because it's a claim. And according to Matt, claims aren't evidence. Now, in this debate later, he doesn't do it here, but in this debate later, he's going to flip the table on the self-refuting argument accusation. And he's going to accuse Jonathan of a self-refuting argument. He don't say it that way, but ultimately that's what he's accusing him of, because he's saying that if you're going to say, and I even had an atheist try to use this argument to me as well, but he's going to say, well, if you say that claims are evidence, then I claim that claims are not evidence, and you have to accept that based on your epistemology. That's what Matt's going to argue. That's completely false, because one, Jonathan's not claiming that all claims are evidence. He's claiming that some claims are evidence. And I word it that way too. It's also to keep us from making a particular logical fallacy. Now I'll point that out here in a minute, because he makes a particular logical fallacy in this. But we don't claim that all claims are evidence. We claim that some claims are evidence. Some claims are evidence, some claims aren't. So we don't claim all. And he seems to misunderstand that, because he'll throw up all kinds of mere assertions and things like that. And a lot of atheists do. They throw up mere assertions and things like that and say, see there, you gotta accept that as evidence. No, that's not what we're talking about. we say that some types of claims, such as testimonial claims, people testifying to what they saw, counts as evidence. We're not saying that all claims, all kinds of claims, including mere assertion, speculation, things like that, are counted as evidence. And of course, evidence is not guaranteeing the proposition. It's not a guarantee for the proposition. What evidence is it supports the proposition. It supports the likelihood that the proposition is true. Another way of putting that. All right. Now, the third problem that it has is a logical problem. Okay. This is the first time anyone, any Christian apologist, any person evaluating the arguments of Matt Dillahunty has ever publicly presented this, because I found this by studying. Of course, I have books on logical fallacies and stuff. And now, when I heard initially, and I heard this probably in his debate with Mike Wingers when I first heard his claims not evidence argument. And when I first heard that argument, I knew something was off, other than the obvious, because I knew it was factually incorrect, because testimony counts has always been considered evidence. But something sounded off with the reasoning. Now, keep in mind, okay, let me clarify something too. Matt's ultimate goal, ultimate intent is to deny the testimony of the disciples as evidence. He doesn't want to recognize their testimony as being true. So how does he do that? Well, he says their testimony is a claim, and claims can't count as evidence. That's ultimately what he's trying to do. What I discovered is that Matt Dillahunty is making a logical fallacy called the existential fallacy. And listen, how this fallacy works is when you go from universal language, it's a syllogism, it's got two premises. You go from universal language to arguing to some. It's like you're recognizing there's members within the group, and then you assume that all of the group succumbs to the same thing, including the specific members of the group. And keep in mind, he's ultimately denying testimony as evidence. That's ultimately his ultimate goal. That's his ultimate goal. All right. Now, so let's formulate Matt's argument. Now, by the way, Matt usually words this like a negative. No claims counts as evidence, which still commits the fallacy because it's using universal language. Things like all, no, none, any, every, all those things are universal language and can still commit the fallacy. But to show you where his fallacious reasoning is, it's better to word his negative in the form of an all statement. It will still have the negative in there, but it'll be easier for me to show you where his argument or his reasoning is flawed. Okay, premise one, all claims are not evidence. Premise two, all testimony are claims. Conclusion, some types of claims, such as testimonies, are not evidence, because that's ultimately what he's trying to deny. This commits a fallacy in logic called the existential fallacy, which actually renders the argument invalid, meaning that the conclusion doesn't follow from the premise. This is where the fallacy lies in his argument, his reasoning. Okay, now, could Matt try to get out of this fallacy? Yeah. He could try to say, well, some claims are not evidence. Okay, that's the reason why I said that Jonathan's not making this fallacy, because Jonathan doesn't say all claims are evidence. He says some claims are evidence. Some claims. If some claims are not evidence, then some claims are. If some claims are evidence, then some claims are not evidence. That's how you get out of the fallacy, is use some. Now, Matt probably likely ain't gonna do that, because if some claims are not evidence and some claims that have to be evidence, then that means testimony is still on the table as evidence. You have to prove that it's not evidence. And you can't do that. He wants to believe that all testimony is not evidence because all testimony are claims, and all claims cannot be evidence. So he's not going to use the word some. He's going to use the word all. What about possibility of saying some testimonies are not evidence? Yeah, that would get you out of the existential fallacy. Now, but you have another problem. What criteria do you say that some testimonies count as evidence and some testimonies don't? What is it? What is the method? How do you know the disciples' testimony isn't evidence? So he's not likely to say that either. What he's likely to do is try to bounce back. The best likely solution for Matt's problem, because he doesn't like the idea of being accused of a logical fallacy, is probably to bounce back to the whole testimony, because he's inconsistent. And if he does that, he's not committing he's inconsistent, but he's not committing the logical fallacy. He's only committing the logical fallacy when he makes this particular argument. That's when he commits it. When he goes back to the other argument and says, well, it's evidence, but I'm just going to make it sufficient to prove the point, then that requires a different response entirely. And he's not making the logical fallacy. None of these errors apply to the other argument. Matt's inconsistent. He will go back and forth on those arguments. Now, what about testimony in itself? Testimony in itself counts as evidence. He said, what about supporting evidence? You know, he says that only the evidence that supports the claim counts as evidence, but the claim itself don't count as evidence. Okay, testimonies can have evidence supporting it. Historians call this supporting evidence. Okay, so it can have evidence supporting it, but that doesn't mean that the testimony itself doesn't count as evidence. It's still evidence. It just has supporting evidence, meaning it has additional evidence that supports the evidence. And other evidences can have that too, by the way, not just testimony. It's just evidence that supports other evidences. And this creates more of a weight with that particular evidence when you have other evidences supporting it. But the testimony does count as evidence. Okay, let's, before we move on, I want to discuss Matt's flawed epistemology. Matt's epistemology is very unsound. I know he gets really mad when people challenge his epistemology. I'm sorry about that. If Matt's watching this video, understand I'm not trying to make him mad. I'm not trying to anger him. I'm not trying to insult him or offend him. That's not my goal. But he does put his epistemology out there, and he does utilize his epistemology a lot during debates and stuff like that. So it's open for evaluation. His epistemology is flawed and unsound. One half of his epistemology says nothing can be proven absolutely. He doesn't, and this is what people usually refer to as Cartesian certainty, absolute certainty. Now, of course, this is self-defeating because the statement that nothing can be proven absolute is itself an absolute statement, because it's making it absolute about absolute. So if you can't be absolutely certain about anything, you can't be absolutely certain that you cannot be absolutely certain about anything. So I mean, it's self-refuting. But okay, one side of his epistemology says nothing can be proven absolute. He doesn't even think his own existence can be absolutely certain. You know, how we know we're not in the matrix somewhere. I think he actually used that as an example in his debate with Braxton Hunter. This other half of his epistemology says that he wants things proven absolute to believe that they're true. He has to have them guaranteed to him. We see this playing out in this debate because every single time Jonathan talks about evidence and he talks about something being evidence, he says the fact that you have that doesn't prove that this is true. Doesn't mean this is what happened. Well, no. No evidence guarantees the proposition. Evidence supports the proposition. It increases the likelihood that the proposition is true. That's the point of evidence. It doesn't mean that it guarantees the proposition. All evidence is subject to evaluation and examination. That includes testimony even. And for some reason, Matt doesn't seem to fully grasp that in this debate. Also, if you watch his debate with Braxton Hunter, a lot of the stuff on his flawed epistemology does come out. All right, let's continue.
I have no problem with that. Please present the likelihood that these stories are true. I don't know who wrote them. How do I know how reliable they are?
The 1 Corinthians 15 creed is in 1 Corinthians, which says it was written by Paul. So we do know who wrote it. Once again, where is he getting this idea that we have no idea who wrote? I don't know. It's like he's attacking the Gospels and then applying that to the whole Bible or something. I don't know.
They are. I don't know who these people are. I have no way to invest.
We didn't know who the disciples were. We actually did. In fact, I think almost all scholars, Christian and non-Christian alike, agree that the 12 disciples existed and that Paul existed. I think that Jonathan McLatchie here has a thing on his channel where he calls into the atheist experience. This is the one. The atheist experience has it's like an organization that's out of Austin, Texas, for the atheist community of Austin, Texas. Matt Dillahunty is one of the main hosts of this program, but for this particular episode, he had 2 different other hosts. Of course, they're all atheists. And Jonathan calls in to talk about the evidence for the resurrection, and one of the woman host said that she denied. I mean, she admitted it was her opinion, her argument, her thinking that it was just her. So apparently, she recognized other atheists don't hold that position. But she said that she denied that apostles existed, which is really weird because no one denied that apostles existed. So this is fundamentally just it's just bad. It shows a lack of knowledge and scholarship. Even Bart Ehrman acknowledges that the 12 disciples existed and that Paul existed. We know exactly who these people were. I'm assuming Matt is trying to deny the authorship of the New Testament, but Paul, I mean, does he deny the 7 undisputed epistles of Paul? I don't know. He never outright says he denies it. I mean, he even talks about Paul. He'll say Paul said this, or Paul, like he argued from silence, and they go, Paul didn't say it, and that sort of thing. So it appears on the surface that he recognizes Paul writing these letters. I don't know whether he does or not. He never outright denies it, but he keeps on saying, "Oh, these are anonymous sources." How is 1 Corinthians, which said, even if he denied that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians, 1 Corinthians says it was written by Paul the Apostle. How is that anonymous? It's not.
Any of the facts about it. So all we have are personal testimonies, which is anecdotal evidence. It cannot rise.
This is the inconsistent part where he bounces back and forth. Let me finish this argument. I do want to discuss the anecdotal evidence. Before I do, I want to discuss this one particular point. Matt wants to know everything about these people that's writing this. What's he want? What's he want? A DNA test? Blood squirt? I mean, a background check? He says, I don't know who they are. Okay, that doesn't make it inaccurate. Even if we had zero information, we have quite a bit about information, but even if we had zero information about the disciples, even if we had zero information about Paul, even though we have Paul's letters and we know quite a bit about both Paul and the disciples. In fact, some of the disciples, like Peter and John, are mentioned directly and Barnabas even mentioned in the 7 undisputed epistles. So we are familiar with who they are intensely, and we got quite a bit of information about them actually. Even if we just consider the 7 undisputed epistles, we know quite a bit about them, and we know what they're proclaiming and stuff. But according to Matt, we can't know anything about them, and he seems to be arguing his lack of knowledge of anything about them has anything to do with whether they're right or not. No, none at all. I mean, there are people that wrote things that, I mean, we're not even certain when Tacitus was born. Does that mean, oh, well, I guess, maybe we can't trust this, or could we lack this information, or, no, no, that we had nothing to do with it. Knowing not that much about something or someone or a particular writer, it doesn't mean anything. And, it's just, we living 2,000 years later. We might be limited on what we know in our information. That's fine, but it doesn't make them historically unreliable. Yeah. And no historian would say, oh, well, I guess we have no idea if what they say is true or not, because after all, we don't know that much about them. So, let's move on, because he's getting into anecdotal evidence, and I want to talk about that, because I'm going to talk about the response to that. Remember, the claims not evidence argument is a different response, because Matt is inconsistent and he's not going to hold to that argument fully. He's going to bounce back and forth. But like I said, testimony can't be both evidence and not evidence. It's just not possible. Either it's evidence or not evidence. It can't be both. But here he's arguing it is some form of evidence, such as anecdotal evidence, but he's going to argue that it's will not rise to the level of convincing. This particular argument does not commit the existential fallacy. So I'm not accusing him of existential fallacy with this specific argument. And so we will deal with the response to that.
To the point of leading anyone to reasonably conclude that somebody rose from the dead.
So it's an inductive argument. So we've got numerous points of historical confirmation in the Gospels and Acts, which cumulatively demonstrates that the authors of the Gospels and Acts, regardless of who they were close up to the facts, and that they are substantially trustworthy, they have reliable access to information concerning the events they talk about. So, for example, are you acquainted with the argument from undesigned coincidences in the Gospels and Acts?
Yes.
All right. He says it's not right that anecdotal evidence doesn't rise to the level of convincing someone. Okay, understand something. Our position with raising up, because in my argument, I do a 7-fact argument on the case of the resurrection, historical case of the resurrection. I utilize an argument that I created I call the historical approach. It's kind of in between the minimalistic facts approach and the maximum data approach. It's just kind of in between those two. And it's my argument, unlike Jonathan's argument, is what's called an inductive argument. We'll discuss that more in detail later on, because they're going to get into this back and forth about Matt not understanding inductive argument. And so we'll cover that when we get to it. But my argument is a deductive argument, which argues from generalities to particulars or generalities to generalities. That's what a deductive argument does. And my argument is a deductive argument. So it uses facts. Of course, all resurrection arguments are cumulative argument. He just mentioned his argument is a cumulative argument. And that a cumulative argument, each fact builds upon itself. And until you got kind of a cumulative effect, a totality effect, where all the evidence and data and facts combined supports the proposition, not just one particular fact or one particular piece of evidence or data. And that's what Jonathan has here. That's what I have in my case. The disciples' conviction that they had seen the risen Christ is fact number 4 in my argument. And if Matt was arguing against me and says, well, that doesn't rise to the level of consider someone had rise from the dead, I'm not saying that. Jonathan isn't saying that. What he's saying is that that Jesus' disciples were claiming that they had saw the raised Jesus. Okay, that's what he's saying. Ultimately, that is combined with other data and evidence, because his argument is a cumulative argument. That's my argument as well. It's a cumulative argument. A pet peeve that I have on a cumulative argument, I'm not saying Matt is doing it here, But pet peeve of mine is when someone takes a fact out of my argument and say that fact doesn't prove the proposition, as if I'm trying to prove the conclusion with that particular fact. I'm not. That fact is combined with other data, with other evidence, and I'm trying to prove the proposition with the whole shebang. That's what I'm trying to do. Now, in the point of what Matt's saying here, he says it shouldn't rise to the level of convincing that someone had rose from the dead. Didn't say it did. I don't think Jonathan's saying it did. What he's saying is that it's enough to prove the disciples were testifying that Jesus rose again from the dead. That there counts as evidence toward it. It doesn't, again, evidence doesn't guarantee the proposition, it supports the proposition. It increases the likelihood it's true. And this, of course, is combined with other data and evidence, as it is in Jonathan's argument. So it's not just one particular fact that we're using to prove the conclusion. It's not just one particular piece of data. I don't think that Jesus rose again from the dead just because a bunch of people in the first century said they did. Okay, it's a combination of evidence. I mean, I look at the origin of the Christian faith. I look at the empty tomb. I look at the fact that we know that Jesus had died by crucifixion. I look at the fact that you got disciples, testimony of seeing the risen Christ. They had nothing to gain and everything to lose. I look at the fact that Paul was converted to Christianity. He didn't believe in it because he said personally, and we have his letters, he said that he saw the raised Jesus, and that led him to convert to Christianity. We have James's conversion to Christianity. He's referenced in the early creed. All of this evidence combined is what points to Jesus rising again from the dead. It's not that one particular fact. It's not that one particular piece of evidence, because it's a cumulative effect that the evidence, all the evidence and all the data and all the facts have together that makes for a powerful case in favor of Jesus' resurrection. And that's ultimately what Matt keeps missing in this debate. All right, Matt, now Jonathan's got on the subject of undesigned coincidences. I don't know a whole lot about undesigned coincidences. I've never really took the time to really seriously study them. I basically know fundamentally what the argument claims because I heard Timothy McGrew, who championed the argument in modern times, along with his wife Lydia McGrew, Lydia McGrew wrote a book. I don't have the book. I thought about buying it before, but it's a book specifically on undesigned coincidences. It's called Hidden in Plain Sight. And of course, Timothy McGrew did a debate with Bart Ehrman on Unbelievable over the undesigned coincidences as well. So I would suggest checking those things out if you want to know more information about that. But basically, undesigned coincidences it's a way of looking that the Gospels are we can see that they're casually locked together by certain references that are not intentional. The Gospel writers didn't intend to put this in there, or didn't put it in there for the purpose of trying to back up something that another Gospel said or something of that nature. It just kind of was thrown in there randomly. It wasn't something that was on purpose. That's why they call it undesigned coincidence. It is, but it agrees in some level with the other gospel writers, what they said. And so this increases, and it's a cumulative effect. And this argument in particular is cumulative because it's a combination of all these casual lockings. It's not just one particular thing. And this helps with understanding that the Gospels, it increases the probability that the Gospels are historically reliable accounts because they have these lockings. Okay. All right, they're going to be getting on the dating of the Gospels soon, so I'm going to let Jonathan's going to talk about his example of an undesigned coincidence. and Matt's going to ask a question about the dating of the Gospels.
Okay,
But
so
you go ahead.
so I'll give one example, and perhaps you can comment on it. So, for example, in this one well-known example is if we go to John 12, this is where we have Jesus approached to Bethany with the 12, verse 1. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, and Jesus is raised from the dead. And they give a dinner for him there and so forth. And the following day, verse 12, he has a triumphal entry, right? He enters Jerusalem on the back of a donkey.
Sure.
So that would be 5 days before Passover, if John is correct on that particular point. Now, is John correct on that particular point? Well, we can evaluate that. So if we go over to Mark's account, chapter 11, this is the parallel account. And he says, when they drew near to Jerusalem, to Bethphage and Bethany, the involved, Jesus sent two of his disciples, said to them, go into the village in front of you. Immediately as you enter it, you will find a colt tied on which no one has ever sat on and bringing. So if we, and Mark actually telescopes the narrative with respect to John, so he doesn't mention he actually arrives in Bethany the night before, it's in the morning he arrives into Jerusalem. But if we assume that John is correct, there's a argument. Get to verse 11, it says, he entered Jerusalem, went to the temple, when he looked around at everything as it was already late, he went to Bethany. Well, that would be the evening of 5 days before Passover, if John is correct. And bear in mind, Mark doesn't give that detail of the 5 days before Passover. Verse 12, on the following day when he came from Bethany, he was hungry. That was the morning of 4 days before Passover. Verse 19, the evening came from out of the city. That would be the evening of the 4 days before Passover. Verse 20, as they passed by in the morning, the salt of fig tree withered away to its roots. That would be the morning of 3 days before Passover. Then in Mark 13, you have the Olivet Discourse on the Mount of Olives, where Jesus talks to his disciples on the Mount of Olives, which is midway between Jerusalem, where he's been all day, and Bethany, where his accommodation is for the night. So we can assume, I think, fairly reasonably that that's the evening of 3 days before Passover. And then chapter 14, verse 1, it was now 2 days before the Passover. So it synchronizes exactly what you would expect, given the historical reliability of those accounts. And building a scheme of argument from numerous examples of not only outside coincidences, but also extra biblical corroborations and so forth, unexplained allusions, I think we have a powerful cumulative argument for an inductive argument for trusting the Gospels to be substantially trustworthy.
How many years apart were Mark and John written?
We don't know. I don't take a position on the dating of the Gospels.
Well, you are taking a position on the dating of Gospels. You're just not giving a date, because the argument that you're presenting presumes that these things were coincidences that were written independently. But if they're both writing accounts of stories that were told, how remarkable is it that somebody would say, hey, Jesus was in this area around Passover?
All right. Dating of the Gospels. Let's deal with that real quick. Jonathan doesn't take a position on the dating of the Gospels. That's fine. I do. I take a conservative position on the dating of the Gospels. I actually date the Gospels on the basis of what I call the evidential approach. I think most scholars use what I call the arbitrary approach, and some of them might even use what I call the presuppositional approach to dating the Gospels. But even the arbitrary approach sometimes is presuppositional in its nature. I don't agree with dating the Gospel using those two approaches. I use what I call the evidential approach. I base it on evidence. I base it on what I know, and then I use that to give a reasonable approximation of when the Gospels were likely to be written. As far as how many years Mark and John are apart from each other, but let's consider the latest possible dates that were given. The latest possible date given for Mark's Gospel was AD 70. The latest possible date for John's Gospel is AD 95. Okay. Now there's a few extreme that will take John's Gospel outside the first century, but they're very, very few and far between. So we'll just go with the mainstream idea and say 70, 95. All right. That is a 25-year difference. I am 42 years old. I can remember things that happened 45 years ago. I know skeptics try to make a big deal out of that. Oh, it's just written 25 years later, as if that is somehow a huge number or something. But in reality, especially in historical studies, it is not. When we have sources hundreds of years after the fact, 25 years is a walk in the park. It's not that much time at all. And no historian thinks it is. No serious historian. I mean, if they have an axe to grind against New Testament, like Bart Ehrman or something, maybe, but not any actual serious historian. Professional historians will not consider 25 years a lot of time. Now he's trying to do this argument to try to point out another thing on these are stories that are floating around. This is a fundamental circular argument. This is actually a circular argument because he's assuming his conclusion, namely that there are stories floating around, and this is the thing that's yet to be demonstrated. Let me. He says this throughout this debate, and he says this a number of times. Let me clarify something real quick. There is 0% evidence that this is true, that the Gospels are made entirely so. I'm not saying that oral culture, the New Testament is written on the background of the oral culture. So we would expect oral culture to be peppered throughout the New Testament. That's expected, okay? Like the 1 Corinthians 15 creed, for example. We would see creeds and hymns like the Karma Christi and Philippians 2, and we do. We see these peppered throughout the New Testament. But that's not exactly what they're arguing. What they are arguing is that the Gospels is made entirely of these stories floating around. Now, that's a different objection. You're not claiming that, oh, well, they're written on the background of an oral culture, so these things are peppered in there. That's not what he's saying. He's saying that they compose their Gospels from and compose these statements from information that is being passed along by word of mouth. This statement comes directly out of form criticism. Now, fortunately, scholars today largely have started to abandon what the form critics claimed. But one of the reasons they're doing it is because they have known for a very long time, and I would even argue since the time of the form critics were around, that their arguments were speculation. That they were speculation. They were not demonstrating at all that this was the case. They have no evidence at all that this is the case. Matt has no evidence at all that this is the case. He assumes it, he asserts it, he dogmatically holds to it. 0% evidence. 0% evidence. Not a shred of evidence that this is the case. It is a circular argument. He's assuming his conclusion. But the thing that needs to be demonstrated is whether or not these stories that are allegedly floating around, which he has no evidence for that either, is somehow being composed in the Gospels. That the Gospels are made up of these stories. That this event of resurrection is not coming from the eyewitnesses, it's just coming from stories that people heard. Even though, granted, the eyewitnesses were still alive, but they were hearing these stories directly from the eyewitnesses, but that gets overlooked apparently. All right. He's about to fundamentally misunderstand undesired coincidences. Let's continue and see where that leads us.
That doesn't demonstrate that just because. So it's like if I made a list of 10 things about Elvis, the fact that I got 8 of them correct doesn't mean that he was abducted by aliens. It doesn't mean that he survived his death and travels around.
All right. He misrepresents historical reliability. Let me explain what historical reliability is. Historical reliability is not inerrant. It doesn't mean that everything that is said is just true. What it does mean is that they're trustworthy. They have a general trustworthiness about them that is considered true. If we can be confident that they got things that we can verify right, then if we know that they got things that we can verify right, this increases our confidence with points that we can't verify. All right. Again, Matt's epistemology wants it guaranteed. He wants it written in stone that it's this way. Any kind of historical argument, no matter what historical argument you make, is going to be based on probability, because that's what historians do. They base it on probability. the likelihood, the most likely probability that something is true. Not that it guarantees that it's true, but whether or not we can have a very high enough confidence to say that we can reasonably know that it's true. This is reasonable certainty. It's not absolute certainty, it's reasonable certainty. But this is at odds with Matt's epistemology because he wants it absolutely certain. He wants it proven to him beyond a shadow of a doubt that it's true. And he doesn't take evidence that increases the probability that it's true. He wants it guaranteed. But this is how historians do history. And this is what historical reliability is about. It's a general reliability involved with the amount of sources of information. And if we have that evidence that it's historically reliable, then we know that it can be generally trustworthy. He's not saying that even let's assume that Matt would be willing to grant the gospel's historical reliability, or that 1 Corinthians is historically reliable and that sort of thing. Let's assume that Matt grants that. He wants it where it guarantees the proposition that that it's true. If he were to take their historical reliability, he's still saying ultimately that he doesn't think that proved Jesus rose again from the dead. But that's not what Matt or Jonathan's trying to argue. He's not trying to argue that definitely makes him that Jesus rose again from the dead. He's arguing for particular points involved with what the gospel tells us about certain specifics as being true. He's not talking about whether that guarantees the proposition, because his argument is a cumulative argument. So it's the cumulative force of all the evidence and data. In fact, like I said before, all resurrection arguments are cumulative arguments. My argument is a cumulative argument. It's a cumulative case where each fact builds upon the other facts, and it's the totality effect. It's the cumulative effect of all that data, of all that evidence combined that points to the proposition. Not one particular piece of evidence or one particular piece of data or one individual fact. That's not it at all. I feel like that Matt is misunderstanding undesigned coincidences. The point of undesigned coincidences is to show historical reliability by the way they casually connect. I mentioned this already. Casually connect in an unrelated to the other gospels. In other words, they're not doing it in a way that is intentional, or they're trying to support something that's said in another gospel or something of that nature. And I think he's misunderstanding the point or the force of the argument by trying to argue against historical reliability the way he's doing. All right, let's continue.
And if I tell parts of a story that were published and told a decade before I ever started, writing on this, how is that a coincidence that needs to be explained when there's stories going around? The notion that we need to explain which parts of the story were written down is bizarre to me, because we have a story that people are telling. Some versions of it get written down. They don't agree. They agree on some details. They disagree on others.
All right. Again, Matt is assuming that there's stories floating around, and these stories are composing in the Gospels. Again, the argument is circular. It's also, it's a circular argument. He has to assume his position. If Matt's watching this, demonstrate that there are stories floating around outside the New Testament, and the New Testaments are taking from these stories and taking them and putting them in the Gospels. Demonstrate that. I dare you. Demonstrate it. Show me evidence. Show me facts. Bring the evidence out. There is no evidence of it. None. You can speculate all you want to, but it's pure speculation. Pure speculation. No evidence. None. None whatsoever. And remember something also, keep in mind, Matt's making the assertion. And since he's making the assertion, he holds the burden of proof. What evidence is there? There are stories floating around that the gospel writers and the New Testament writers are just taking these stories and they're putting them together, and that's what we got in the New Testament. Now, he talks about the agreement among the gospels. Okay, he says the gospels. I put the note. It says the gospels do agree. They do. That they differ on. They have differences, but they are harmonious. They can be reconciled. In fact, the vast majority of them can be reconciled pretty easy. Most of them are just complementary details, like the number of women at the tomb, that sort of thing. When there's neither one of them is contradicting the other. It's just adding additional information. Skeptics often treat the Gospels as if it's omitting a detail, and another Gospel adds a detail, then the Gospel omitting it must be denying that the event took place. But that's not the case. It's not a denial. This is also a red herring with the resurrection. It's a red herring because the fact of the matter is that we can have differences in account. Like I think I gave in one of my videos of this debate review series I'm doing. I mentioned the difference of the Fire of Rome, 8064, three sources that we have that have differences. They have differences that aren't really reconcilable even. But nobody throws the baby out with the bathwater. Nobody just assumes the whole account can't be trusted. They still consider it historically reliable, even with the differences. They all agree on the Fire of Rome in 8064. That's the one thing that they agree on. So why would you sit there and abandon that just because there are differences around that event? You wouldn't. Okay, they all agree that Jesus died by crucifixion. They all agree to his burial. They all agree to him rising again from the dead. They all agree. They all agree to that extent. And on top of that, the resurrection proclamation is much earlier than the Gospels. So it's not like we're just getting our claim that Jesus rose again from the Gospels. We're getting it earlier, much, much earlier, within a few years of the event. So yeah, this is a red herring. This is an irrelevant statement or claim or argument that has nothing to do with issue needing to be addressed. In this case, the issue that needs to be addressed is the resurrection appearances. Did it happen? Did the disciples really see Jesus? Did they claim to see Jesus? Were they lying about it? Things like that. Did the resurrection actually happen? That is the question. Okay. Trying to sit there and say, well, the Gospels have differences in it. What are you going to do with that? Well, don't have to do anything with it. It has nothing to do with Jesus' resurrection. The resurrection was proclaimed much earlier than the four Gospels. So yeah, this is just a red herring. All right, let's continue.
There's a hypothesis about shared documentation, about Mark being written first and Matthew basically copying off of Mark, Luke basically copying off of Mark. We don't know. However,
All right. Let me explain the market priority and Q hypothesis real quick. All right. There is a literary connection between the synoptic gospels. In fact, the word synoptic actually means seen similar. And it's so obvious within these three gospels that in some cases it's even stated verbatim. In some cases, the order of the events are the same. The kind of miracles, the kind of content, the kind of statements, the kind of all these things, they're pretty much aligned. And this leads us to believe that there is a literary connection between Matthew, Mark, Luke. Okay. John's gospel is not considered to have this literary connection because 90% of John's gospel is unique to John. So that means that John is considered by all scholars to be wholly independent of the Synoptic Gospels. Now, there are some people that dispute whether John even knew about the Synoptic Gospels. Bart Ehrman, for example, don't think that John even knew about the Synoptic Gospels. I disagree with him. I think that John was aware of the Synoptic Gospels, but I don't think he chose using the sources. But I don't think that. But I think the evidence is strong in support that he didn't use them as sources at all. Like I said, 90% of the gospel is unique to John. I think John was his own source. All right. I don't think I do think that he was aware of it. There's reference toward the end of John's gospel that seems to indicate that he was aware of the possibility aware of the Synoptic Gospels, because he mentions that other people, he's aware that other people wrote things down about Jesus, and more things can be said about his life and ministry and death and resurrection because others have written about it. But in any case, this also makes me think that John was aware of the Synoptic Gospels as well. I don't think that he used the sources though. So John is completely wholly independent. Okay, now there is a position. There's two positions actually of Synoptic Gospels. Well, technically three. One of them is called Markan priority. This position is taken by almost all scholars, myself included. It basically says that Mark was written first, and then Matthew and Luke, and Matthew and Luke likely used Mark as a source. Another position is similar to that. It's called Matthew priority. I used to take this before I started evaluating evidence with Mark's gospel being the earliest. And in Matthew priority, it basically says the same thing as Mark priority. The only difference is that it has Matthew as the first gospel instead of Mark. It's a minority position among scholars, but some take that position. I don't take it. I used to, but I don't take it anymore. All right, and then of course we also have the Q hypothesis. The Q hypothesis says Q comes from the first letter of the German word Quelle, no relation to Quella de Vil, I'm sure, but the German word Quelle, which means source, and that's what that comes from. So this is the Q hypothesis, or the Q source, as that people like to say, and this claims that either Matthew and Luke used a common source, which scholars label as Q, or Luke used Matthew as a source. Q, of course, is completely hypothetical. It's completely hypothetical. We don't know whether or not if there's a Q document. I have no problem with someone saying, all right, the common source material between Matthew and Luke, which, by the way, is considered sayings. And so if Q existed, it was a sayings document. It's like saying, okay, I don't have a problem with someone saying, I'm going to label the common source material between Matthew and Luke by this code letter Q and calling it the Q material. I'm fine with that. I have no problem with that, because you're simply saying this is the common source material between Matthew and Luke. I'm all right with that. But when you take it further than that and you say, well, I'm going to argue for this extant document we don't no longer have or even know ever even existed, and you try to argue from that, then you wind up going into speculation, because we don't know if that document exists. We have no evidence of it. The closest we have is a statement made by Papias about Matthew writing the Logia, which means sayings or oracles, originally in Aramaic. It too is a Semitic language like Hebrew, and it's a very close or similar Semitic language. And so most likely he referenced it as Aramaic, or referring to Aramaic. But either way, Hebrew or Aramaic, But what about this issue of copying? Some skeptics misunderstand both Mark-in priority and the Q hypothesis and assume they're copying. Actually, they're not. They treat him like they're cheating off of a test, basically. Like, Matthew looking over Mark's shoulder and saying, "Hey, Mark, what do you got for miracle number 2 over there?" Like they're cheating off of the SAT exams or something. That's not how historians and scholars are looking at it. It's more like Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source of information. They stuck closely with it at times, but they still felt liberty to be able to sit there and adapt, to utilize their own literary conventions, to be selective with the information they could present it, and so forth. Otherwise, it would be, if they were copying, if they had a wholesale copying, there would be no difference at all in the Gospels, if that was the case. So it's actually contradictory, because if they were sitting there, had a wholesale copying, then it would be exactly the same in every respect, and there would be no differences. But the fact that there are differences indicate that this did not happen, even among the Mark-in material still. But in any given case, Matt obviously misunderstands the Q hypothesis and Mark-in priority. It is not them copying, like cheating off of a test or something. All right. All right, let's continue.
You want to look at this and say, hey, they both said that Jesus was in town around Passover. And my thing is, so what? That has nothing to do with the divine, with the supernatural, with the resurrection, with any of that stuff. It's the most mundane, pedestrian. It's like, you might as well say, look, 2 of the Gospels reported that Jesus ate lamb along with potatoes and Rocky. Oh, no, that'd be alcohol. Yeah, screw it. We'll get Jesus some alcohol. And Rocky at the final dinner with the disciples. Cool. How can I ever verify that? Why would I care that they wrote down the same thing? None of that gets to the truth of whether or not there was.
All right. He's actually misrepresenting his argument on divine, on undesigned coincidences. I'm gonna let him finish that thought because he's about to make a straw man that is intentional. I'll let him finish the thought. Okay.
Is a resurrection. So if we're going to be talking about whether or not there's strong evidence for a resurrection, Jesus being in Jerusalem around Passover isn't strong evidence for a resurrection.
So you're completely correct. But the example I gave doesn't pertain to the resurrection. The point is,
I understood the point.
Let me finish.
I wasn't done, but go ahead. I let you talk for a long time. I understood the point was to show that these corresponding accounts demonstrate the reliability and truthfulness of the witnesses that are reporting the Gospels. Am I correct? And that's your point? Correct. So I wasn't an idiot who missed your point. I just hadn't finished yet.
Okay. Right.
The fact that that you consider them reporting mundane things as if that means they're truthful and honest doesn't mean that they are accurately reporting other things that happen. I have no problem with them reporting what they believed to be true, but what people believe to be true is independent from what's actually true.
All right. Basically, he set up a strawman argument. He set up a strawman argument where he attacked a position that he wasn't holding. He was trying to prove a particular point. Jonathan was. Okay? Matt tried to attack a point that Jonathan wasn't making with the undesigned coincidence because he wasn't trying to prove Jesus rose again from the dead with it. But Matt knew that. How do we know that he knew that? He just admitted to knowing that. Now, understand something. I'm a nice guy. I try to be. I can be assertive in debate, especially when dealing with someone like Matt Dillahunty, who's pretty aggressive at times. And I can be very assertive, and I consider myself a blunt person, but I don't necessarily. I don't cross that line between being blunt and being disrespectful. No, I've seen people so blunt that they tell you every mean thought that they were thinking about you, and they don't care what you think about, what they think about you. And I'm not like that. I'm a nice guy. I'm not disrespectful. I try not to be. Um, and of course, it is in my nature to give people the benefit of the doubt. And so my nature is that I would want to give Matt the benefit of the doubt. And normally I'd probably come up with all kinds of excuses. He wouldn't even have to come up with excuses. I'd probably come up with 10 of them because I'm trying to give the man a benefit of the doubt. The reason I can't do that in this case is because he admitted to knowing what Jonathan's point was, and he correctly defined that point. But yet he argued for a point that Jonathan was not making. He was not making that Jesus rose again from the dead. That means, because historically trusted means Jesus was rising again from the dead. That's not the point he was trying to make. That's not the connection he was trying to make. But Matt was arguing it. Matt knew that he was not trying to make that point. So this is not just any straw man that Matt is setting up. It is a intentional straw man. He is on purpose straw manning Jonathan. This is bad. This is very bad. I don't like it. I'd rather it wasn't true. And like I said, my nature, the way I am is I want to get 10 or 15 excuses to take up the Matt because I want to give him the benefit of the doubt. But he just got through admitting, knowing what Jonathan's point was, correctly defined it, and then argued that this does not mean that Jesus rose again from the dead, knowing that that's not what Jonathan was trying to argue. He intentionally set up a strongman argument. I hate it. I wish it wasn't true, but you heard it for yourself. All right.
And so you can say all day long that even though we don't know who wrote those Gospels, and I would agree, that they are generally trustworthy. I think I would agree that they are generally trustworthy on some aspects of it, but I don't think that me telling you a story about, Elvis doing Blue Hawaii means that if I also tell you a story about how he rose from the dead and was abducted by aliens, my truthfulness is no longer relevant. It's not about whether or not I'm an active liar. It's about whether or not I'm likely to be correct or whether or not I have a bias in my story.
All right. All right. Several points here. Okay, Matt appears to misunderstand what historical liability, which is not in there. See, we already dealt with that. He also misunderstands the point. The point of his argument, or point of historical reliability, is not to say that it's in there, and he's missing the point of Jonathan's argument, because Jonathan is trying to argue that that the Gospels are historically reliable, and he says that okay, what is the likelihood that lying is not in question? Wait a minute. One point in his argument, he argues, well, that doesn't mean they're telling the truth. That doesn't mean they're not lying. And another one, he said, oh, well, the point is how likely it to be correct. Both of these, and this is actually setting up an either or fallacy, because it's not one or the other. We both want to know whether or not if they're lying about it and if they're right about what they're saying. And of course, to do that, we look at a lot of different evidence. We look at a lot of different factors. It's not just one piece of data that we're looking at. And I think Matt misses the point on that. He referenced a bias argument. Being biased doesn't make you wrong, doesn't mean you're lying, and doesn't make you inaccurate. The fact of the matter is, everyone is biased. Everyone is biased. And every source that's ever been written is biased. Every source, every person who's ever evaluated any biased source is biased. I'm biased. Matt is biased. You are biased. We are all biased. Does that make us wrong? No. Does that make us inaccurate? No. Does that mean we have to have a guarantee that we are going to have inaccurate information? No. Does that mean we're unreliable? No. Does that mean we're wrong? No. Does that mean we're prone to fabricate information? And by the way, most people that do have a bias in favor of it, they think they're right. So why would, I mean, there are occasions where someone might fabricate something if they're really convinced it's true, but they don't have no evidence of it and they're trying to produce evidence for it. That happens. But most people don't usually lie to support their bias because they think they're right. They think they're right. Now, there are exceptions to that. There are occasions, a police detective can really convince that this person did the crime but don't have no evidence of it, and plants evidence. Or in a situation where, like in the Haeckel's embryos, where Haeckel fakes the drawings to give evolution some evidence. He really believes in evolution. That's what. There are some hoaxes and fabrications along those lines. But most people usually don't lie for their bias because they think they're right. So they don't usually, it doesn't usually occur. I'm not saying it never occurs. It just doesn't usually does. Matt's bias, the bias argument that Matt's presenting is literally self-refuting. And the reason I say it's self-refuting is because Matt himself is unreliable. Or more, excuse me, correct that. Specifically, he is a bias. He has a bias. Matt has a bias. And Matt is saying that you can't trust these documents if they have a bias. Then why should I trust his statement that I can't trust those documents because they have a bias when he has a bias? You see where the problem lies? It's actually a self-refuting argument. Because once you realize that everybody has a bias and there's no truly absolute neutral stance, sometimes we talk about neutrality as being unbiased, but what we mean by that is that they don't have a bias in favor of the particular position in question. That does not necessarily mean they don't have any bias. They could actually have a bias opposite of that. And so if you're going to argue that I can't trust this particular document because they're biased, then you can't trust any source in history. But it gets even worse because why should I trust the person who said that? Because they have a bias too. Matt has a particular agenda. He doesn't believe in the New Testament. He doesn't believe in the Bible. He doesn't believe in Christianity. He doesn't believe in the existence of God, or at least he doesn't think there's evidence of the existence of God. Is how he usually words it. And that agenda rules his thinking on the New Testament. Does that make his statement untrue? No. Does it mean he's lying? No. Does it make him unreliable? No. Other things might make him unreliable. Other things might work to that end, but him being biased don't. Now, bias does create kind of a lean for those things. I absolutely agree, it does. But it doesn't make it unreliable, doesn't make it accurate or inaccurate, and it doesn't mean that they are fabricating. So it's not that Matt is just arbitrarily assuming these gospels are reliable. Let's take their word for it. Let's just, just be gullible as possible. That's not what he's argued. In fact, he hasn't argued that the entire debate. Matt has accused him of it, but Jonathan has not argued that in the entire debate. He's not arguing for absolute gullibility at all. But anyway, the bias argument never works. It really isn't. It's a self-refuting argument. It's a two-edged sword. It cuts both ways. I could easily say you're biased. Why should I trust you? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's like shooting your own self in the foot in the process. All right. All right. I'm gonna move on.
And it's undeniable the gospel authors have a bias, right?
Sure, but I mean, yeah, sure. I wouldn't dispute that. But
And the gospel writers do have a bias. Nobody says otherwise, but that doesn't make them wrong, inaccurate, or unreliable.
that doesn't mean that they weren't reliable or truthful reporters.
I know, but that also doesn't mean they are. That's my point. I'm not saying that they're not reliable. I'm saying you don't get to assume they are.
Again, that makes no sense. He's basically, what he's doing is he's trying to shift the burden of proof. He doesn't think that the gospels are reliable. Okay, Matt or Jonathan has showed evidence where they are reliable. Okay, he said, I'm not. Jonathan don't get to assume that they are because they have a bias. But bias doesn't make them unreliable. Okay, and why would them having a bias mean that Jonathan can't assume that they're reliable? If we have other reasons for believing that they're reliable, it makes no sense. I mean, it's not like he's choosing to believe whatever the Gospels say without evidence that shows that they're reliable. He's not arbitrarily just, giving into absolute gullibility or something of that nature. Now, Matt has accused him of this a number of times throughout this debate. But Jonathan, he has never argued for that. Ever. In all this debate, he's never argued for absolute gullibility. But that is what Matt assumes. So, yeah, they have a bias, and it's good to recognize they have a bias. It's good to recognize that we have a bias. Now, I have a bias, that Matt has a bias. It's good. I think that's great that if someone recognizes their own bias and the bias of others. But don't use that as an argument that you can't trust something. Because automatically, as soon as you do that, you're guilty of there's actually a fallacy in logic that it actually violates. It's called the circumstantial ad hominem. When you assume somebody's bias makes them not true or unreliable or inaccurate, then you're committing what's called the circumstantial ad hominem. It's apparently Matt is making this ad hominem against sources, but he's still making it. It's also known as the appeal to bias fallacy, because when you assume that a person's bias makes them wrong or unreliable. Now, Matt will probably say, oh, I'm not assuming they're unreliable, but he is assuming they're unreliable. He's assuming it. Now, is Jonathan assuming they're unreliable? They're assuming their reliability? No. Jonathan is using evidence to back up their reliability. He's not assuming it. Matt, however, is assuming they're unreliable. And he's telling Jonathan, no matter how much evidence you have for the gospel's reliability, because they're biased, you don't get the chance to even assume that they're reliable. Because after all, even though there's evidence that they're reliable, we just have to throw that out and assume that they're not because they're biased. And that's just not the case. That's not the case. If we have evidence of the reliability, there's no point. I mean, it's appeal to the bias fallacy. It's a circumstantial ad hominem. It doesn't work. It's never worked as an argument. It's self-refuting. It's commits that fallacy in logic. It's factually true. It doesn't take into account the fact that everyone and every source that we ever read, even in the modern period, has a bias. Every scientist has a bias. Every historian has a bias. Every person has a bias. There's no such thing as a truly neutral person. None. Now, there's a lot of atheists that think they're neutral, but what they really mean by neutral is non-religious. That's what they mean by neutral, because they think that if they don't have a religious bias, that means they're not biased, but they are biased. They are. Now, I don't know if Matt would recognize he has a bias, but he certainly seems like he's willing to say, okay, yeah, we do have biases. But I don't know. I don't know. Nobody's ever really spoke about it, that I've seen at least, spoke about it with Matt Dillahunty as far as whether he believes he has a bias or not. I think Braxton Hunter talked a little bit about bias debate. I can't remember what the exchange was. Matt Dillahunty and between Matt Dillahunty and Braxton Hunter. But in any given case, let's continue with this.
Right, but the point is that when you consider numerous instances of verification of the Gospels between themselves, the way they interlock in a casual and subtle way, the way that they intersect with extra-biblical secular sources, I can discuss many of those. That provides a prima facie basis for trusting them on issues that we cannot directly cross-check them on, because it shows that they're close up to the facts and that they are substantially trustworthy and reliable in reported to be events talk about.
Yeah, that'll never fly. I love my mother, and my mother has sent me letters, essentially telling me that she wouldn't lie to me, and God is real and Jesus is real. I don't believe my mother's lying to me. I just believe she's wrong. I believe she's sincerely conveying information that she's wrong about, because so in the case of this, you're wanting to say that somebody's reliable when you have no access to that person at all, other than here's something they wrote, something fairly small that they wrote, that you can't go out and investigate. You can't determine the truth of anything. So
all right. By the way, if Matt is asserting that, I think I didn't address this very well. If Matt is asserting that the Gospels are historically unreliable, especially after God has presented evidence of their reliability, then the burden of proof is on him to prove that. Simply saying that they're biased, which, by the way, I would consider bias a dismissal argument. It's just intended to dismiss the arguments and evidence without ever giving it a thought, without actually engaging in the evidence. Oh, they're biased. Okay, so does that make what they're saying not true? Well, no. Does that make them lying? No. Does that guarantee, that they must be historically unreliable? Well, no. Well, you just can't assume that they're reliable. Why can't I assume that if I have evidence of the reliability? So that's something you have to take into consideration. And Matt does appear to misunderstand it in that argument. Now, I want to give him the benefit of the doubt. If you are in a casual conversation with Matt, maybe he can correctly define an inductive argument. They're going to get into an interesting discussion later on about inductive reasoning. Because Matt appears, and I say appear, I'm not accusing him of not understanding inductive argument. I'm saying it from the surface, I can tell why Jonathan assumed that he didn't understand an inductive argument, because it appears like he doesn't. Because the way in which he's arguing right now makes it sound he doesn't fully understand that Jonathan is arguing for a particular, and this is how inductive reasoning is done. Particular to generalities or particular to particular. That's how inductive reasoning is. To sit there and go from what he's trying to argue and make a beeline for the resurrection. Well, that'll prove Jesus rose again from the dead. And if Jonathan is trying to prove that Jesus rose again from the dead by that one particular that he cited, and he's not. So Matt appears to be misunderstanding inductive reasoning. All right. And he says we can't investigate it. Yes, we can. We can investigate it historically. Listen to what Matt had said. This is the kind of epistemology he has. He wants it guaranteed to him, okay? So he wants to be able to talk to the witnesses. which wouldn't really guarantee him anyhow, even if he had access to the witness. But he wants access to it. We don't have access to any of our witnesses in history. We don't have access to Josephus when he reported on the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. He was an eyewitness to that event. The fact that we don't have access to Josephus doesn't mean we don't have access to what he wrote. And what he wrote is good enough to establish what historically happened. And we can investigate it. That's why we talk about historical investigation, because we can investigate it historically. And by the way, there are scientists that actually talk about things which I have no access to. That things like multiple universe hypothesis and black holes and things like that, and string theories and quantum mechanics and things like that. Things in which they have zero access to. They don't have access to any of this data. But they still postulate it. They still theorize it. They still try to make an argument from what they know and what they observe and things like that, and make all kinds of theories on it. I'm not saying they're all correct. I don't agree with a lot of them, but I'm saying that they do postulate them. This idea that somehow, if we don't have access to it, then we can't trust it. Where's he getting this? No scientist thinks this way. No historian thinks this way. No scholar thinks this way. Why does he think this way? Because it's his flawed epistemology. All right, let's continue.
You don't know how reliable they are on the parts that you can. You don't even know if they're reliable about the Passover thing, even though it's coincidentally reported.
Well, we do, because I just showed the way the interlock casually, so it points to proof of narrative.
No, it doesn't. It does not. It does not confirm that that's what's actually happened. Are you saying that 4 people couldn't get something wrong?
No.
I didn't put this in my notes, but I did originally when I went through this debate originally, and the one that I lost and the one that I couldn't upload to YouTube because it was too long. Basically, Matt is denying, or actually, he's not just denying it, he's misunderstanding multiple attestation. Now, this wasn't really Jonathan's argument specifically, and so he goes into the argument, and so Matt's like, okay, because, if he's not arguing that, then okay, I'm gonna see what he's arguing. So he let Jonathan talk, which I'm glad he did that. But what Matt is basically saying here is he's denying multiple attestation, and 2, he's misunderstanding it. All right. He has a tendency to deny scholarly criteria. This comes out in his debate with Mike Winger, which I really want to do Cameron, if you're watching this video, get in touch with me. Let me know if Cameron from Capturing Christianity. Let me know if I can do a debate review of that debate, because I really would like to do a debate review of that debate between Mike Winger and Matt Dillahunty. But in that debate, it came out a lot that he denied historical criteria like embarrassment. It comes out in this one too, that he's denying embarrassment. And this right here shows that he also is denying multiple attestation. And on top of that, it shows he doesn't understand it, because he thinks that we're saying something has to be true if 4 people said the same thing. That's not what multiple attestation is saying. Multiple attestation, remember, historians work off of probability. And what multiple sources say, now it doesn't make it wrong if only one source says it. Okay, it doesn't somehow decrease its probability that it's true just because one source says it. We could have other reasons for trusting that one source on top of that. Plus, a lot of history is based on single sources. But if we are lucky, fortunate enough to have multiple sources talking about the same event, like the fire of Rome that I brought up, we have 3 sources: Tacitus, Suetonius, Theocastus, and they all agreed that the fire happened. All right. What multiple attestation does is it increases the probability that something is true. It does not guarantee that it's true, okay? And the lack thereof doesn't decrease its probability. I mean, you only have one source, doesn't decrease its probability that it's true. But if you have multiple sources, it increases the probability that it's true, the likelihood that it's true, not that it guarantees the proposition. Okay. And Matt seems to remember Matt's epistemology, the other half of it says it has to be guaranteed. It has to be guaranteed. But it's not isn't guaranteed. In history, we don't look at guarantees. We don't look at absolutes, we look at probabilities. We look at what's probably true. Multiple attestation increases the probability, the likelihood of it being true based on the evidence. That's what it is. It's more likely to be true than not if multiple sources are saying the same thing. And it's got to be independent sources. Okay, keep in mind. Independent sources. Okay, multiple attestation. He appears to be denying it, and he appears to be misunderstanding. All right, let's continue.
Well, that's not the argument.
Okay.
But the argument is that they fit together in casual ways. So, for example, Mark and John seem to be independent on this. So Mark telescopes the narrative. It's John that gives us the extra details, and where he arrives in Bethany the night before. In the morning, he gets to Jerusalem. Mark 13 doesn't even give us the timestamp. You have to do the inference because the men involved can move to Jerusalem. We've been all day in Bethany where the accommodation is for the night, and so forth. And so they interlock in a way that points to the truth. They interlock in a casual, non-deliberate, non-designed way, and furthermore, John actually contradicts Mark on the issue of when exactly Jesus was anointed at Bethany. In Mark, it's after the triumphal entry, and John is before.
I wouldn't really say this is a contradiction. I don't think Jonathan really meant contradiction in a strict sense. He could have, but I doubt it. But this is probably likely displacement, possibly. Displacement's a literary device that's used in Greco-Roman biographies. Michael Conan talks about it in his book, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? I'm not going to go into that right now, but I'm just saying, for the sake of clarity, I don't think that these are contradictory statements.
So if John's
one of the things that I keep hearing, I don't know if you follow this, when people point to that where they disagree, I got a lot of people tell me that makes them even more strongly convinced. Do you think the part where they disagree makes them, does that more strongly convince you?
All right. First of all, they don't disagree. These are differences, yes, but they're not disagreeing with each other. Secondly, the fact that they have differences in them is expected by historians. I don't know why this is so hard for a lot of skeptics to wrap their brain around. But if these gospels were exactly the same in every respect, we'd accuse them of collusion. We'd accuse them of borrowing. Look what people are already doing just because they're similar. Okay, just because they're similar, they're already accusing them of literary borrowing. All right. Imagine if they were exactly the same in every respect. You would think they got together and had some kind of meeting and decide what they're going to put in the document, like the Declaration of Independence or something. Like they just decide what was going to be in there and then copied it. You think they cooked it all up? You thought, because you ever heard that situation or saw that situation or been in that situation where got with some friends and say, let's get our story straight. And then you rehearse what you're going to say. Well, if they were exactly the same, that would be the case. And that would decrease its likelihood that they were true, not increase it. The fact that there are differences means that they're independent enough. In fact, this is also one of the strongest evidence against the idea that they were copying in the sense of cheating off of a test, which is how skeptics, including Matt, seem to take Markan priority base. Each writer is his own person. Matthew isn't Mark. Mark isn't Matthew and Luke. Luke isn't Matthew and Mark. The synoptic writers ain't John. John ain't the synoptic writers. They're different writers. They're writing different works. They're distinct from each other. They are utilizing various different types of literary conventions, which was common in Greco-Roman biographies. They were writing to different audiences. They had different purposes in mind. All these things account for the differences. In fact, historians actually expect differences in them. Yes, historians expect differences within the Gospels. As legal professions expect differences in witnesses' testimony. If two witnesses said the exact same thing in every respect, then they would assume that those two witnesses got together and made the whole thing up. It's the differences that help us understand that that didn't happen. And that's what they're trying to tell Matt, those people that he's talking about. And Matt seems to think, oh, well, differences in the Gospels must make them unreliable. That's Bart Ehrman's argument, right? If they're different, then that must make them unreliable. No, that increases our confidence that they are reliable because we don't think that they got together and they cooked this stuff up. It's not that hard of a concept to understand. All sources, there are multiple sources, have differences in them. Historians expect it, legal professionals expect it of other witnesses. We all expect it if what they're telling us is not something that's fabricated and something they got together with their buddies and got the story exactly right. We expect differences. Legal professionals expect differences. Historians expect differences. It's not that hard to understand. With the Gospels, we have those differences. So this increases the chances that they're not doing, getting together and cooking this thing up.
It depends on the nature of the variation. So there's a phenomenon that I call reconcilable variations, which is when you have two accounts which appear on first blush to contradict one another, but then upon learning some new information or inspecting the accounts more closely, they turn out to actually fit together naturally without straining after all. And in that case, I would argue that is evidence for independence, which indeed is evidence for the reliability of the account.
Yeah, except that you can't make an argument for independence when both people who are writing something have access to the stories ahead of time.
All right. A number of assumptions in this. We already dealt with the whole stories thing. The fact of the matter is, this is a pure conjecture. Like I already said, it's circular argument. He has to demonstrate that these are stories floating around that they're putting in there, not just assume it. But that's what he's doing. He's assuming it. He isn't demonstrating it. It's 100% speculation. And he's also making another assumption. He's assuming that this story isn't coming directly from the eyewitnesses. But I think we can do even better than that. 1 Corinthians 15 creed, which we can trace historically back to the disciples, like I already did. Trace it right back to the disciples. So Matt is assuming that this story is coming from the outside community rather than from the disciples themselves. But because of the historical evidence that we have, we can actually trace this information back to the disciples themselves. I know Matt's not going to agree with that. That's fine. But he disagrees with it without rhyme or reason. There's no actual evidential reason for him to disagree with it, and lots of evidential reasons to agree with it. So understand that even though he might say, I don't think that, that works, okay, he can believe whatever he wants. But I'm looking at the evidence. The stronger the evidence, the more I'm convinced. And we have really strong evidence that the disciples themselves were proclaiming that Jesus rose again from the dead. And also, by the way, he's assuming that any story that is coming from this community outside of the New Testament isn't getting their information from the eyewitnesses too, who, by the way, was still alive when this was proclaimed. In fact, this was proclaimed shortly after Jesus' crucifixion. So you're talking about a very early proclamation. And you're telling me that nobody was around that could say, yes, I seen it. I saw this event happening. Yeah. Also, Paul recounts his own testimony of seeing the risen Jesus. So I mean, yeah. So I don't think that works as an argument. It's pure speculation, and it's completely speculative. Um, all right. Let's keep going.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it doesn't have to be a Q document. It doesn't have to be another gospel. It could just be, these are the stories that are going around. And this guy wrote this version of the story, and this guy wrote this version of the story. And the source of the particular thing claims where they claim, it's not coincidental. It is derivative of the oral tradition.
Yeah, so the Earth.
Yeah, Matt is appealing to possibilities. Yeah, it could be possible that those things could be correct, but again, no evidence.
Source idea, something Richard Kira put forward on his blog. I responded to the unsigned coincidence argument, and other people have put forward that objection as well. I responded to it quite extensively at my site. I'll just very briefly respond to it here. There's a number of problems with that. One is that often you find intersections between different pericopes in the gospel accounts, and the oral traditions would have corresponded to you wouldn't have an earth source or oral tradition which contained the entire gospel accounts. So the fact that you have these interlockings between different accounts or different pericopes, different stories, even if it is derivative from earlier oral traditions that predate the gospels, that would still be an example of an undesigned coincidence, so it wouldn't refute the argument. It's also ad hoc. It's invoked only to get around the hypothesis of truth rather than the simplest explanation, which I think is that these events really happened. So there's a number of issues with that. And also evidence for independence. And the particular example I gave, Mark and John, I would argue that John and Mark are reporting independently on that particular issue.
And I still don't see how that makes any difference, because are we suggesting that someone who we consider truthful couldn't also be honestly mistaken or even actively lying about a secondary statement?
Well, it provides evidence that they are.
That's not my question.
No, listen to me. It cumulatively provides evidence that the authors of the Gospels and Acts are close up to the facts, and that they have reliable access to information, and that they're habitually truthful.
No, it doesn't. It shows that they at least have access to the same story. Whether they have access to the same story because they heard the same story or because they are actually witnesses to the same story are two independent things. But even if they were witnesses writing what they think happened, that does not mean that their attempt to be honest and accurate means that we have good access to what the facts are. This is what, how many?
All right. There were several points. I was letting them continue their conversation. All right. All right. About the active, is it possible they could be actively lying or sadly mistaken? Anything's possible, but this commits the appeal to possibility fallacy. And and what evidence does Matt have, again, that these guys are just hearing these stories and passing? He throws this assertion out there. I wish Jonathan had challenged this. I don't know if he's familiar with the scholarship on the subject matter or not, but I wish he had challenged Matt on this. What evidence do you have that they're just hearing these stories and they're putting it in the New Testament because they're hearing these stories from the community, from the surrounding community? What evidence do you have that that's what happened? You keep asserting it, you're dogmatically holding to it, but what evidence do you have that that's what's happening? You don't. So, well, isn't it possible that this could happen? Well, yeah, it's possible that the disciples are really space aliens from the planet Zuzu, and they, for kicks, they decided to raise Jesus from the dead. If you get creative and imaginative with it, just about anything can be possible. But it's a question of probability. What's probable? What's likely to happen? What's likely to be true? And the fact of the matter is, just because something's possible doesn't make it probable. And that this is why this is a fallacy in logic. And a lot of people make it in debates, and Matt makes it a lot. He throws up these general possibilities, and When you challenge it, he retreats back in the shell and says, "Oh, I'm not really arguing any of these possibilities. I'm just saying it could happen," because he doesn't want to be challenged on it. And so when someone does challenge him, he retreats from it. But the fact of the matter is, if you're going to throw these possibilities at us, then let us deal with these possibilities. All right, let's continue.
Many people have been falsely convicted because somebody was absolutely convinced that that's the person that attacked them. Okay, we're not talking about like the eyewitness testimony that you decided just to shrug off. I'm saying if I find someone, like, I won't use you, we'll stick with my mom. My mom is absolutely, I'm convinced most of the time, sometimes she lies. I'm convinced most of the time she is actively trying to tell me the truth. The problem is that when she tells me what she's convinced of, and I ask, what's the reason that you're convinced of it? She doesn't present arguments. She doesn't present evidence. It is trusting. And that's exactly what you seem to be arguing for here, that we have these accounts in the gospel, and the gospel authors are otherwise trustworthy, and therefore we should take their word for it when they report that someone was raised from the dead. Now,
all right. Okay, I got 3 points here that we need to go over. All right. First off, the testimony is counted as evidence. Okay. Again, Matt seems to be assuming that someone testifying something doesn't count as evidence, and he's assuming that in order to be evidence, it has to be guaranteed. That's a guaranteed proposition, and that's not the case. Evidence supports the proposition. It doesn't guarantee it's true. It just supports it. It increases the probability that the proposition in question is true. It doesn't have to guarantee it for it to be evidence. And of course, all testimony and all evidence is subject to evaluation and critical examination. And of course, Jonathan isn't arguing that we should accept, and he said this repeatedly. I mentioned this already, I think maybe in the previous video, but Jonathan said repeatedly in this debate. He said already once before that I'm not saying you should accept it credulously, without any reason at all. He isn't supporting absolute gullibility. He said a number of times, let's look at the particulars of the case. We got to look at the particulars of the case. Let's look at the specifics. Let's deal with these. That's what Jonathan is trying to argue. And he said this a number of times. But Matt keeps treating Jonathan like he's only accepting the stories because they said so, and we don't have any evidence at all that it's true, and let's reject testimony as evidence. Testimony is evidence. It is evidence. Matt might not agree with it. Matt might not like it. Matt might not think it's enough, but we have evidence. Regardless, what do you think? All right. He also makes the hasty generalization fallacy at one point. The fact that some testimonies are wrong or unreliable doesn't make them all wrong. He seems to assume, even if he might sugarcoat it a little bit and say, I'm not saying all of them are wrong, I'm just saying most of them are wrong. Okay, that's fine, but it's still a hasty generalization fallacy. You're taking a few examples of unreliable testimony and then generalizing it to make it look like it's including all of them or most of them even. But they're not. Okay, I think it's very over exaggeration when they say that eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable. I think that's just completely bogus. I think that's an extreme over exaggeration. But it also probably depends on what they are actually considering to be unreliable. Are they calling something unreliable because there are differences? All witnesses have differences in what they're saying. But if they think the Gospels are unreliable because they have differences, then maybe they think that all eyewitness testimony that has differences, which is all eyewitness testimony that can be trusted, has these differences in them. Therefore, they must be unreliable. That's completely incorrect. And differences in things like minor details and things like that, what color car they have, and doesn't mean they're wrong on the major stuff. But reliability, of course, is general trustworthiness. I don't think most of them are unreliable. And it commits the hasty generalization fallacy. What they'll do is they'll take certain examples of actual unreliable eyewitness testimony. Let's say, I think Bart Ehrman used an example of someone accusing someone of rape who didn't rape them. You know, they got confused about what the person looks like or something in the event. In which case, he then generalized that to all other eyewitness testimony. And I'm not saying Matt thinks all eyewitness testimony, but he thinks it's most eyewitness testimony is unreliable to a point where we shouldn't trust any of them. And that's just not the case. That's just not the case. They actually commit a fallacy in logic called the hasty generalization fallacy. Okay, Matt presents a bogus analogy. This is an analogy of his mom. His mom doesn't give him any reason other than just believe. But you can't really sit there and say, okay, that represents the average Christian. That represents most of them. I always give reasons why I believe something is true. Always. I don't just simply say I believe on faith alone. You know, I believe in faith. But faith, it's misguided to think that faith is believing something without any reasons. That's a misguided view of faith. It is not actual faith. What probably likely happened if his mom really ain't giving any reason, then just believe, is that his mom just doesn't know the reasons. She believes it, she accepts it, but she may not know that there's actual genuine reasons for believing that God exists, that Jesus was raised from the dead, etc. She might not be familiar with the other evidences and stuff that entitles that. The fact that your mom cannot give him a viable enough reason. And of course, I've seen what Matt accepts or doesn't accept as viable reason. He doesn't accept testimony as viable. He doesn't accept actual historical evidence as viable. He wants to talk to the witnesses, and he wants DNA evidence and blood samples and fingerprints and everything else you can think of. He wants to know all kinds of information about them. But no, that's just not the way it goes. That's the fact that mom doesn't give him reason doesn't mean there isn't reasons to believe Christianity is true. All right, let's continue.
Now, I will never, ever accept that as a good reason to believe that somebody was raised from the dead. But if the story is in fact true, then it seems to me we should, if there's a God, have access to much better evidence so that you don't have to come to me and say, hey, look, I really researched these gospels and this one said this and this one said this. It has nothing to do with the resurrection. I think these guys are trying to be honest. I think they're telling the story as best we can. This is the best evidence that we have. Well, if the best evidence we have is still insufficient to demonstrate the likely truth of the proposition, and for resurrection, our prayers are not minimal. They're zero. Apart from the Bible claiming that Jesus also raised the dead, for which we have no evidence of that either.
Now, Matt, of course, appears to be having his presuppositions on his sleeve. That's clear. He assumes his worldview first, and he thinks you have to disprove his worldview, it'll prove your worldview. But if my worldview contradicts his worldview, and if I can have evidence that my worldview is true, and it's really strong evidence to Jesus rising again from the dead, then that disproves his worldview. That becomes the evidence of the supernatural. But he rejects that evidence, and so he argues in a circle. Of course, attacking the Gospels themselves is a red herring. Resurrection was talking much earlier. I already mentioned that. The fact that Matt Dillahunty is not convinced has no bearing on the arguments at hand. He's not convinced of it. That's fine. But has nothing to do with the weight of the arguments. He always has to makes it look like he has to be convinced for the argument to be strong. And he wants DNA evidence for a historical figure. So the way I'm looking at this, his requirements are unreasonable requirements. Why would you want a blood sample of somebody that lived long if we applied that type of standard on the rest of history, we wouldn't believe anything at all in history. Do we have a blood sample of George Washington? Do we have his fingerprints on record? Do we have George Washington in front of us so that we can talk to him and ask him questions? No. Does that make anything that we know about George Washington false? Not one bit. Not one bit. All right, let's continue.
Do you think that the dead crawled out of their graves and marched on Jerusalem? Do you think that all of these others?
Yeah, that happened. The fact that Matt doesn't agree with it doesn't make it happen. Matt has his presuppositions on his sleeves. His whole worldview is basically the defining point of Matt. It's what ultimately determines whether he's going to agree with something or not the evidence, his worldview. Testimony itself does count as evidence.
Supernatural things happen where, where do you draw the line on, hey, and someone I consider, who I've never met, but someone who I consider to be a reliable witness, is telling me about a miracle. How do you reject all the claims of the spirit men from other religions who claim that they don't eat food, that they live off prana, and they have acolytes, and they have people who are willing disciples of them, who follow them around? Now,
all right. Spirit men that can go a long time without food. Okay, this is just a false analogy fallacy off the rails. I mean, we can go long times without food today. I mean, there's people that fast for long periods of time all the time. That's not exactly a supernatural phenomenon. In fact, we can actually live longer without food than we can without water. Scientific fact there. The fact that people are survived a long time without food, how is that a comparison with someone rising from the dead? Well, they live, okay, fine. I'm okay with the idea that they had spirit men. I don't know what spirit men is, by the way. I don't know if it's a figment of someone's imagination. I don't know. I have no clue. I've never studied it. I've never even heard of it, to be honest. Matt Dillahunty brought it up in this debate. But the reality of it is that, first of all, we're not accepting testimony, not uncritically. Again, this is what he assumes throughout this debate, but Jonathan's home over and over again. We have to look at specifics. We're trying to look at the particulars of the case. We're not accepting it uncritically, but Matt seems to be attacking the idea of total gullibility, which Jonathan is not presupposing. He's not presupposing total gullibility. Matt is arguing against it. He's strawmanning against it. But Jonathan isn't presenting that case. That's not what Jonathan is arguing for. It's not really a true comparison. It's a false analogy fallacy. Okay, Matt is getting into what he thinks Jonathan has a double standard. Now, if y'all are familiar with my debate review with Anuj Agrawal from India, I have it on YouTube, uploaded to YouTube. It's on my channel as well. It's divided into 8 parts. But in that debate review, Anuj kept trying to accuse me of double standard. In fact, that was his main argument throughout the whole debate. And what he was basically doing is a fallacy in logic called the slippery slope fallacy. And Matt does it a number of times in this debate as well. He also does it in his debate with Mike Greenberg. The slippery slope fallacy basically says that if A, then B, then C, then D, without having any kind of causal connection. You have to have a causal connection between A, B, C, and D. I could have different reasons for accepting A and other reasons for rejecting B. Perhaps there's good evidence for A, but not for B. Or perhaps we have evidence against B. I don't have, just because I accept A doesn't mean I have to accept B, because I can have different reasons for that. I can have good, strong reasons to accept A. And I could have very good, strong reasons to reject B. The idea that I have to accept one, I must accept the other, commits the slippery slope fallacy, which is what Matt's committing here. He commits this quite a bit throughout this debate, because he's basically, he doesn't say it outright, but ultimately he's accusing Jonathan of the slippery slope, or accusing Jonathan of having a double standard. But reality is Jonathan doesn't have a double standard. It's Matt making a fallacy in reasoning.
You can't test them. How do you say that those people aren't tied to the facts, and yet the ones you're citing are?
So the point is, if the gospel acts are based on eyewitness testimony, then we have to take seriously that what they say concerning the nature, variety, the resurrection encounters with the risen Jesus goes back to the early apostolic eyewitnesses. And then that's what needs to be explained by looking at sifting through the hypotheses I offer. Namely, it argues against the myth hypothesis, and then we have to consider, okay, were they honestly mistaken, or were they deliberately lying? And the fact that they're substantially trustworthy is evidence that they were not deliberately lying, although it's not explicit proof, but it is evidence for that conclusion. You could also look at the fact that the apostles were willing to die as martyrs for their testimony, which also contributes evidence to the fact that they were not deliberately lying about what they allegedly saw.
Just asked you how you distinguish between the people who you think you're being honest and have access to the facts for the religion that you accept. I distinguish between those and the people who are making claims for other religions that you don't accept. And instead of giving me anything close to how you would tell the difference, which is what epistemology is about, how I tell the difference between, hey, this religion, you're basically saying these religious accounts are true and these religious accounts over here are not true. And you have no better evidence for your truth than they have for theirs.
All right, I got 2 points on this in my notes. All right. Jonathan does answer him. He doesn't answer in the way that he liked, but he answered him. The fact of the matter is that he keeps telling him that, you got to look at Jonathan is. And Matt is thinking that Jonathan is somehow accepting the testimony without any reason. He says the evidence is no better for that. Yes, it is. Actually, it's much better. Let's contrast other religions and religious claims. The Quran is primarily about Jesus, right? In Islam. Okay, the Quran is 600 years after Jesus lived. 600 years later. Okay, the earliest biography that we have of Muhammad is 125 and 150 years after he lived. About 150 years later. Okay, let's look at Buddhism. The earliest thing that we have written on Buddhism, either the Buddhist scriptures or Siddhartha Gautama, that's the founder of Buddhism. Siddhartha Gautama's biography. The earliest thing we have written on it is 500 years after Siddhartha Gautama. Does that mean, well, it doesn't mean he doesn't exist, obviously. But it's the earliest thing we have on. Because Buddhism started out as primarily a world religion for the first 500 years of its existence. So the earliest thing we have written is 500 years later. And legends started coming on Buddhism 400 years later. Okay? The earliest thing that we have on Apologetics did a lot, at least in the earliest source we have. The earliest source we have on Apologetics is it's not really a biography, it's a historical novel. I've got a video actually on the life of Apologetics in Gospels Greco-Roman biographies. Because the life of Apologetics is a historical novel. It's not very biography. I know some people dispute that. Greg Keener talks about it a number of times in his book, Christobiography. But it is a historical novel, but it's about Apologetics, right? The earliest thing that we have written on Apologetics is about Apologetics. He was writing in the early 3rd century. And I will tell you a lot of the same miracles Jesus did in the Gospels, at least in his work. Now, I think that those guys is copied from the Gospels. But in any given case, we have that. Okay, it is over 100 years removed from the life of Apollos. Over 100 years removed. Okay, now let's look at the Gospels. The Gospels, even by skeptics' opinion, and that's assuming John, the latest of the Gospel, and assuming liberal dates from John's Gospel, is about 60 to 70 years afterwards. And that's considering the latest of the Gospel. So if you say Mark, you're looking at 40 years. Now that's just the 4 Gospels. Of course, we got information about Jesus even earlier in Matt, found within the epistles of Paul, and the resurrection proclamation, which is way earlier. 1 Corinthians is written in the mid-50s, 80, 55. It's one of the 7 undisputed epistles of Paul, and it's 25 years after Jesus was mentioned. The creedal information within 1 Corinthians 15 is dated within a couple of years of Jesus' crucifixion. Within a couple of years of Jesus' crucifixion. How in the world does that mean, oh, we got to accept other testimonies that we accept by the Bible's testimony? We have better evidence for Jesus' resurrection and for Christianity than we have from any other religion on earth. Name a religion. Name one. It don't have better evidence than Christianity. So why in the world does Matt think I have to accept other testimonies if I accept the testimonies of the disciples? And they're far earlier, far greater evidence, far better evidence. Again, Matt is just assuming his position. He's assuming the evidence is not that great, but it's actually very, very good. Because he doesn't recognize testimony as being good evidence. That's his main problem. He don't let Jonathan really explain it. He just simply assumes that Jonathan is rejecting these other religions about rhyme or reason. Actually, I don't think he got to his answer yet. Let me get to that answer now. I'll respond there.
Because what you have is a claim from someone who you find truthful. Now, are you just going to say that for all those other religions or for those other supernatural accounts, you just don't find those people truthful?
Yeah, you have to.
Okay. Then I don't find yours truthful, and there's no point in having a debate because we no longer give a damn about epistemology. We're just going to go with how our gut feels, right?
Well, we're going to look at the evidence. And
I've been asking for evidence. Do you have any evidence?
Again, he doesn't let Jonathan explain. Jonathan's trying to explain. You look at the evidence, you look at the particulars, you look at the specifics. That's what you do. We're not saying, oh, we have testimony, makes it true. We got to accept whatever other religions say, even if they're 10, 1,000 years later or hundreds of years later. We got to accept them. We accept them, what the Bible says when we're dealing with information that's much closer to facts. That is so ridiculous. It just, I don't even know how how someone can say that with a straight face. I just don't. Yeah, you won't let Jonathan explain, but he's talking about that particular case. All right, he's getting into the Bible. I'm gonna let him finish that thought.
It doesn't come from the Bible.
No.
Okay. So you have nothing but a hearsay account from an unidentifiable source.
Yeah.
All right. Matt is presupposing that the Bible can't be used as evidence. And I think I've already addressed this in a previous video, but it's just not the case. The Bible can be used as evidence as long as you back up what you're using. And he's been doing that. But what Matt does is he likes jumping around. He'll say, well, that doesn't prove that they're telling the truth. that they're being honest. And he proves that they're being honest. He says, well, that doesn't prove that what they're saying is true. And he proves that, well, that doesn't mean that what they're saying is actually happened. Well, then he proves that, oh, well, you know, Matt doesn't want to give you your way no matter what. And every time you do, he jumps to something else and says, yeah, but that don't mean this. And then even though you already proved that. And also, he's assuming that the Bible is one source. We've talked about that many times because he keeps doing it. He keeps assuming the Bible is one source. He keeps saying it's anonymous. If Matt's watching this, how is 1 Corinthians anonymous? How is 1 Corinthians anonymous? The very first verse says it's written by Paul. Even if you reject that, how is it anonymous? It's not anonymous. So why does he keep saying that? He keeps saying statements like that. Not only does he have no evidence for it, but there's evidence against it. It's completely false. It's not true. Even if you reject the authorship, it's still not true because they're still identifying the author. So how does Matt get out of that? I don't know. All right, let's continue.
We have evidence from the New Testament, including Paul and the Gospels. Yeah. So why don't you start responding to the evidence rather than just dismissing it?
It's not evidence, it's claims, not evidence. There is no evidence. There is no physical evidence. There is no, what you can do is you can say that.
All right. Matt is constantly doing this dismissal argument. I've told y'all already. Dismissal arguments, they're pet peeves of mine. I don't like them. They prevent a true interaction with the arguments, with the evidence. I don't like that. Even when I'm watching debate, I want the debaters, whether I agree with you or not, I want them to interact with each other. I want them to interact with the evidence. I want them to respond to each other. I want them to present counter arguments and things like that. I want to see that in a debate, not for entertainment purposes, so I can get the issues and the arguments fleshed out of both of them, so I can see where they're coming from, so I can understand whether they have any evidence for the position and whether or not if that evidence warrants the proposition in question. I want to know whether or not what they say is true. And I want them to flesh those issues out. And they can't do that with one of the parties not engaging the evidence. Matt is not engaging the evidence. He is not engaging the arguments. And I have a serious problem with that because in a little bit, Jonathan's about to leave for about 5 minutes. All right. And the reason he does is because he's frustrated with Matt. He gets frustrated with Matt at one point. And we'll talk about that frustration in a little bit, but he always dismissed it. And that's a problem for me. Because I want the arguments to be engaged. I want the issue to be fleshed out. He talks about later in the Q&A, I just want to have a conversation. Okay, that's fine. Have a conversation. Conversations are two-way. Conversations are you and him trying to understand what you're actually trying to argue. Conversations isn't, I'm going to try to win this debate at all costs, even if I misrepresent his positions to do it, even if I have to argue against a point that he's not making, even if I have to dismiss everything he's saying without proving a thing or disproving a thing. Yeah, I'm going to do it because I want to win this argument. The problem, however, is that that's not how arguments are won or debates are won in the first place. So yeah, I have a real problem with his dismissal arguments. What about Matt also made the claims not evidence argument again. And I've already mentioned this. I mean, it's factually inaccurate. We know testimony is evidence. I mean, you can't even look the word testimony up in the English dictionary without being defined as evidence. It's evidence. And I told you it's rhetorical, it's self-refuting, but it's also commits the existential fallacy. I already mentioned that. I'm not going to go over that again, but it actually commits a fallacy in logic called the existential fallacy. The only way to get out of this is to say some claims are not evidence. But if some claims are not evidence, then some claims are evidence. And Matt doesn't want to argue that, so he tries to argue that all claims are not evidence. But that's just not the case. All right. He argues, he wants physical evidence. He says evidence is physical evidence. No. Physical evidence is one type of evidence, but evidence doesn't have to be physical to be evidence. It could be testimonial. And again, remember, he's flocking back to the claim that evidence thing. I told you he's very inconsistent. One minute he's admitting it's evidence, but he thinks it's weak evidence. And then the next minute he's denying it evidence altogether. So he bounces back and forth on this because he is not very consistent in his argumentation. So this is expected of Matt, at least. It's not good. It's not right. He should be consistent, but he's not. But in any given case, now he's fought back that it doesn't count as evidence at all. Because in order to be evidence, it has to be physical evidence. No, it doesn't have to be physical evidence. Even in a court of law, testimony is considered direct evidence. It's not even considered circumstantial evidence. Circumstantial evidence is indirect evidence. But in a court of law, it's direct evidence. And I'm not trying to do as Matt did in contrast to courts of law with historical studies. I'm just simply saying they consider it evidence. And by the way, so do historians. So evidence, testimony is considered evidence. Evidence does not have to be physical. Evidence could be sources, evidence and sources, such as documentation and that sort of thing. Even courts of law uses documentary evidence. And of course, historians rely on it because history is made of nothing but literary documentary evidence. Archaeology gives us a little evidence. The only physical evidence I can think of relating to historical studies would be archaeology or similar historical studies. But archaeology is a separate discipline, and archaeology gives very little information about the past. Most of what historians know about the past come from literary documentary sources. All right, let's continue. It's about to get a little heated.
That there are people who wrote stories and you find them compelling, and I don't.
If you're just going to keep dismissing the evidence, then we're done.
Yes, we are. We are. And you know whose fault it is? The God that you believe in, because the God that you believe in is too stupid to understand that when he presents something in a way where it's indistinguishable from other things that are false, that's the end of the conversation. I didn't make up the rules about what counts.
All right. Jonathan just left, by the way. Let me, I'm going to put this right here because here in a second, I'm going to talk to you about Jonathan leaving because a lot of people have made a really big deal about him leaving in this debate. In fact, this is probably the most talked about thing. Jonathan leaving for 5 minutes is more talked about than any other part of this debate. I'm serious. Look on the comment section. This is the one thing that everybody's geared to. Just they glued their attention to this one thing. All right. And we're going to talk about it in a minute because everybody's making a big deal out of it. But first, I want to cover the last few points I got in my notes. It's not God's fault that Matt Dillahunty is not convinced by good evidence. It is Matt Dillahunty's fault. Persuasion is a choice made by the person being persuaded. Okay? It is not God's fault. It is Matt's terrible, unsound, self-refuting epistemology that is the reason that Matt's not convinced. It has nothing to do with God. Let me ask you a question, Matt, if Matt's watching this. Matt, if you're watching this video, I think I might have already asked this in a previous video, maybe on Matt Dillahunty. possibly in this debate review series. But let me ask a question, honestly. What if God knows exactly what would convince you that, and it's nothing at all? Nothing. Nothing can convince you because you're already set in your ways. You're already convinced of your worldview, and you set your standard in a way in which nothing can be convinced. You have to be convincible. You have to be open to being convinced, and you have closed-minded yourself to the point, made yourself hyper skeptical to the point where good reasons and good evidence can convince you. And when people present good evidence, you dismiss it and say they don't present good evidence, or you think they didn't present enough of it, or you don't think they present any of it. That's problematic. That is very, very problematic. It is not God's fault that you're not convinced, Matt. It is your fault. It is your fault. And calling God stupid and stuff, how is God stupid because you're not convinced? God presented, I'm not saying this is the purpose of the resurrection. I don't think this was the purpose of the resurrection to begin with. But let's say that God really wants someone to be convinced. We have strong evidence for Jesus' resurrection. So strong that it has convinced a number of skeptics that Jesus did rise again from the dead. So it is very strong evidence. It's strong historical grounds for it. Just because Matt doesn't think it is, doesn't make it not the case. So yeah, he just rejects other testimonies as evidence. He just rejects testimony as evidence. And we already discussed this, and we discussed the fallacies and the flaws in this argument of claims not evidence as well. Finally, I want to talk to y'all about Jonathan leaving. Jonathan leaves. He says when he comes back, he's frustrated with Matt because Matt kept interrupting him, wouldn't let him talk. He dismissed everything he said. Jonathan made a statement, and instead of letting Jonathan explain what he meant in that statement, Matt jumped all over it and refused to let him talk. He even got mad and aggressive on it because Matt typically has a reputation in his debates of getting very aggressive with people. Of course, Matt's a sort of debater, and I'm a sort of debater. And he does admit when Jonathan comes back, he's prone to it more than others. But the main thing I want to talk to you about is the kind of things that are being stated in the comment section of this debate, as well as the comment section of debate reviews that Jonathan had and all these kinds of things. Because everybody is treating it like Jonathan left and he must have called the debate and Matt won because no. Listen. Okay, Jonathan leaves for 5 minutes. Okay, he comes back and he gives an apology to Matt. He apologized for it. He even admitted that it was wrong of him to leave another debate review that he did with Braxton Hunter. And he admitted it was wrong of him to leave. And I agree, it was wrong of him to leave. He shouldn't have left. Now, with that said, this has no bearing on the weight of the arguments that he presented in this debate. He left for 5 minutes. This doesn't dismantle his case just because he left for 5 minutes. All right? Lots of people are making too big of a deal out of him leaving for those 5 minutes. Okay? Matt made a big deal out of it. Other people made a big deal out of it. It's not really that big of a deal. How many times have you been debating somebody? You get so mad and upset with them debating, you just walked away from the debate. The fact that somebody walks away from a debate has no bearing on the arguments. None. He still made a very powerful case. He made a very powerful argument. And the fact that he left for 5 minutes doesn't change a thing. Nothing. And certainly ain't gonna change my mind when I assess the winner at part 5, at the end of part 5 of this debate video. Okay, it's not going to affect it at all. It's not going to impact it, because the reality is it has nothing to do with the arguments. He's winning this debate because his arguments are stronger, and because he's not dismissing what Matt is saying without rhyme or reason. He's engaging with it, whereas Matt is dismissing everything Jonathan is saying without rhyme or reason. And dismissal arguments, in my opinion, are by their very nature weak arguments. He's made a number of logical fallacies, Matt has, including arguing from silence with Paul. Yeah. So the point is that that Jonathan did not lose this debate because he left for 5 minutes. Because at the end of the day, someone leaving the debate for 5 minutes has no bearing on the argument in question. Jonathan made a good case, which Matt dismissed without rhyme or reason, and Matt did not engage the evidence. He did not engage the argument. He just dismissed the evidence because he didn't think it was evidence, even though it was evidence. He was delivering dismissal arguments. With that said, I will be continuing this video, of course, whenever I get to the second segment of the open dialogue, which I'll call Open Dialogue 2, in which case it will deal with it will start out where we left off here. Okay, they're going to go into Q&A for a little bit, for a few minutes, until Jonathan returns. And when Jonathan returns, and then we continue that. All that's going to be in the next segment of the Q&A. I've got the notes already. It might come out pretty soon. In any case, let's click it back over to my closing arguments. Thank you. And now I'm back. All right. I'm really enjoying this debate review. I hope you are too. And I had fun making it. I really did. I thought this was a really good debate in the sense. I don't like the fact that Matt keeps dismissing Jonathan's arguments. We started off pretty good. Ended this video with some aggression on the part of Matt because he thinks that somehow, I don't know why he thinks this, because Jonathan's consistently telling Matt, we got to look at the specifics, we got to look at the particulars, we got to look at that. We're not saying accept testimony because so-and-so said so. We're not saying that. We're looking at the testimony. Testimony comes as evidence. This testimony is early. It's from a reliable source. We got early creedal tradition that's in 1 Corinthians 15, goes back within a few years of the events. And it's testimony. He said, well, this is claimed not at which commits a fallacy. So, yeah, Matt is constantly dismissing everything Jonathan's bringing to the table without rhyme or reason. Not because it isn't evidence, because he doesn't want to believe it. He doesn't want to agree with it. I found Matt's arguments to be heavily presuppositional. Of course, this video ended with Jonathan leaving. He left for 5 minutes. No big deal. It's not the big deal that everybody's blowing it out of proportion. It doesn't mean that Jonathan called the debate because he left for 5 minutes. Okay? Debates are won or lost on the basis of the arguments. Jonathan's the only one that brought any evidence to the table. Matt didn't bring anything. All he did was dismiss everything that, without rhyme or reason, dismissed it. Then he tried to accuse Jonathan of doing that when Jonathan wasn't doing that. And he said the entire debate, he said, we have to look at the specifics. We have to look at the particulars. I'm not saying we have to accept it credibly or without any reason at all, of accepting it. And then, but yet Matt is constantly strawmanning Jonathan's debate. At one point, he was strawman in this particular segment. He strawman Jonathan intentionally. He knew exactly the point that Jonathan was trying to make. He even said it and correctly defined it, but yet he was still arguing, knowing that Jonathan was not arguing that. Knowing that Jonathan was not arguing that, he still argued it. Why? I don't know. Maybe because it's easier to tear down a straw man than it is to deal with the actual arguments. And Matt didn't want to deal with any of the arguments. So I found his assertions to be unconvincing. His arguments were just unconvincing. He never presented any evidence. He never does. He dismissed everything that's brought to the table. So debates, one of the benefits I think is of a debate is that you got to be able to flesh out the issues. You present both sides of the arguments. People need to hear both sides. People need to know both sides. People need to know what the evidence is, what the arguments are, what the responses are. This kind of flesh all that out. But if you got somebody that's not really bringing anything to the table, he just simply dismisses everything that you're saying without rhyme or reason. And then he accuses Jonathan of doing that when Jonathan isn't doing that. But to all his atheistic supporters, he thinks, oh, well, he must be doing it. No, he's not doing it. That's the thing. He is not doing it. It is Matt that's doing it. So, yeah. His claims not evidence argument commits a number of errors. Has a number of problems with it. Has 3 problems with it. It has a factual problem. It's factually inaccurate because testimony does count as evidence. You can't even define testimony without defining it as evidence, as far as the English dictionary goes, at least. It has a rhetorical problem because it's self-refuting, because it in itself is a claim, so it's self-refuting argument, and it has a logical problem. It commits the existential fallacy, which renders the entire argument invalid. It would be a valid argument if you say some claims are not evidence. But Matt's not going to argue that, because if some claims are not evidence, then some claims are evidence, which is what Jonathan's arguing. So he's not actually committing the existential fallacy, but Matt is. So yeah, again, I hope you like this video. Please don't forget to like this video. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel. And also hit the notification bell. That's the way in which you get notified for any new videos that I post. And I'm posting constantly. I am posting constantly. I plan on doing the second segment to the open dialogue segment very, very soon. It all depends on what happens, but I'll try to get it within the next couple days if I can. Probably likely Friday, because I'm actually off work Friday, so it's probably going to be about Friday, between Friday and Saturday. Alright, which if it happens Friday, by the time I manage to get this video uploaded to YouTube, it's probably going to be Friday for that video, so it might even be the same day you're watching this that I upload the second segment. In either case, it will be uploaded. I will be doing the second segment. I already got the notes for it, so it's just a matter of sitting down and doing the video. But I hope you like this debate so far. I mean, I hope you like this debate review more specifically. The debate was, it could have been better if at least Matt would have dealt with the issues and dealt with the arguments instead of avoiding dealing with the arguments and dismissing them and evading them and strawmanning Jonathan and committing all kinds of other logical fallacies and things like that. It would be a lot more better if Matt didn't do that, if he just engaged in the evidence instead of just dismissing it and having his presuppositions on his sleeves as he goes into this. Oh, you gotta prove his worldview false, or I'm gonna assume my worldview true. Well, I guess when it comes to being skeptical of the Bible and Christianity, anything goes. But when it comes to truth, well, you're limited on what you're allowed to use. You're not allowed to use testimony. You're not allowed to use the Bible. You're not allowed to use evidence. Don't use anything that could prove Christianity is true. because you just have to assume it's false, just like they do. I don't find that kind of argumentation very compelling. You shouldn't either. It's a very bad way of arguing. But in any case, I will probably see you pretty soon on the next segment of the open dialogue section of this debate review of this debate between Dr. Jonathan McLatchie and Matt Dillahunty. And I also want to leave you with this one general understanding. Always learn the facts that the critics don't want you to know. Thank you.